You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. My name's Wilhelmina Sorensen, though nobody's called me that since my grandmother's funeral. Everybody just says Billy. I'm 38, and I make my living chasing quiet. I'm a field recordist out of Denver, the kind of job you explain to people twice and they still think you're a birdwatcher with a microphone. I record wind, water, dawn choruses, the hush right before a thunderstorm breaks. Stuff that ends up underneath a meditation app's voice or lays through some nature documentary nobody watches twice. My ex, Theo, used to say I was in a long-term relationship with silence, and he was just renting the guest room. My best friend Priya was supposed to come with me on this trip, split the driving, keep me from talking to myself too much, but she bailed 2 days out. A work thing, always a work thing. So, I loaded up alone and pointed south toward the San Luis Valley. The San Luis Valley doesn't look like much from the highway. Flat, pale, rimmed by mountains that seem too far away to be real, until you get close enough to see the dunes rising out of it like something spilled from a bigger world. I'd read about great sand dunes for years, the way the wind sings across the ridgelines if you catch it right, and I wanted 3 clean nights of that sound before some contractor's leaf blower ruined my week. At the entrance station, a ranger named Colton stamped my backcountry permit and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that some of the old ranch inholdings along Medano Pass were closed to foot traffic this season. Resource management, he said, wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't push. I filed it away the way you file away a stranger's warning you don't plan on needing. I've got rituals I don't apologize for. Before I sleep anywhere new, I walk the perimeter twice, check my tire pressure even if I haven't driven, and lay out my gear in the exact order I'll need it if something goes sideways: flashlight, boots, keys, in that order, every time. I'm not proud of how much of my life runs on that kind of insurance. I picked a legal disperse site off the Medano Pass primitive road, tucked my van between 2 pinyon pines, and by sunset, I had a shotgun mic rigged on a stand 30 feet out, aimed at nothing but open dark. Around midnight, the wind dropped to almost nothing, and that's usually when the valley gets interesting: coyotes, owls, the tick of cooling metal. What I got instead was a low, even thump, spaced every few seconds like something had a pulse. I told myself it was a loose strap slapping the roof rack, or some rancher running an irrigation pump way off in the valley bottom. Sound carries strange out here, bounces off the dune field and comes back twisted. I've chased down plenty of mystery noises before that turned out to be nothing. A plastic bag and a juniper, a woodpecker with main character energy, a gate hinge 2 ranches over. So I didn't lose sleep over it. Not that first night. I logged the clip, tagged it investigate later, and in the morning I hiked out to Zapata Falls with a water bottle and a granola bar, the kind of ordinary tourist thing that made me feel normal again after a night alone with a microphone and my own imagination running the show. That's where I met Desmond Rios, a horsepacker in his 50s who ran trail rides for an outfitter out of Alamosa and knew the valley the way most people know their own kitchen. He had a face like old saddle leather and a laugh that came out before the joke was finished. We got to talking. He was curious about the mic rig. I was curious about anything he could tell me about the land. And he mentioned, easy as weather talk, that there'd been a religious outfit that leased grazing rights up past the primitive road decades back, some self-sufficient group that mostly kept to themselves and mostly stayed gone. Mostly, he said, and let it sit there, like the word was doing more work than he wanted it to. I've built a career on being the person who goes looking for the sound nobody else bothers to record, and something about an abandoned religious compound in the middle of nowhere lit up every professional instinct I had. I asked Desmond where exactly, and he got vaguer instead of clearer, waved a hand toward the northeast where the dune field folded into scrubland, said something about how the BLM had fenced off the old inholding, and it wasn't really camping country anymore anyway. I clocked that as the same closure Colton had mentioned at the entrance station, filed it next to the strange thump from the night before, and felt that specific itch I get when 2 unrelated facts start looking like they might be related after all. I moved camp the next afternoon, a few miles up the primitive road, closer to that scrubland fold Desmond had pointed toward without meaning to. There was a sign at a cattle guard, faded and peppered with old buckshot, marking the inholding boundary. No trespassing, private lease, the kind of sign that's been there so long it's practically part of the fence. The road itself stayed public past that point, I told myself, so I wasn't breaking any actual law by driving it, just satisfying curiosity from a legal distance. I parked in a wash a half-mile short of the boundary, close enough to walk it later if I wanted, far enough that I could tell myself I hadn't really decided anything yet. That night's recording session gave me the first sound I couldn't explain away with weather or wildlife. Underneath the wind, faint but rhythmic, came something that had structure to it. Not words exactly, more like the shape words leave behind, rising and falling in a pattern too, even to be random. I sat in the driver's seat with my headphones on, volume up, heart doing something uncomfortable in my chest, and I ran it back 4 times before I trusted what I was hearing. My professional brain wanted to call it wind through a culvert, some acoustic trick of the terrain. The rest of me wanted to start the engine and put the valley in my rearview mirror. I did neither. I just sat there listening, the way you can't stop touching a bruise. By morning, the fear, or whatever you want to call that feeling, had cooled into something more manageable. Curiosity with a seatbelt on. I told myself I'd walk to the boundary fence, nothing more, just enough to see if there was a structure out there that might explain the sound, and if anything felt wrong, I'd turn straight back around. I left a note on my dash with the date and a rough plan, an old habit from solo backpacking trips, texted Priya even though I had no signal, so it'd send whenever I found a bar. Desmond had said he'd swing by that outfitter's camp 2 days from now to check in on me, unprompted, which I appreciated more than I let on. Then I laced up my boots and started walking north, toward the fold in the scrubland. The walk out to the boundary took longer than I expected, the way distances always do in country this flat. You can see for miles, so your brain tricks you into thinking things are closer than they are. The scrubland past the dune field was scrappy, rabbit brush and cholla, and old fence posts leaning at angles that suggested nobody had maintained them in years. Except that wasn't quite true. Every so often I'd pass a fence post that was clearly newer, cut lumber instead of weathered wood, staples still bright instead of rusted. Somebody was tending part of this fence line, while letting the rest of it rot for show. That inconsistency bothered me more than any single strange sound had the night before. Sound can be explained away, but maintenance takes a person, on purpose, recently. About a quarter-mile short of the cattle guard sign, I found a fence post wearing something that had no business being on a fence post in the middle of nowhere. A small solar panel, maybe 6 inches square, wired to a box painted the same gray-brown as the wood to hide it. I've rigged enough remote recording gear to recognize a trail camera setup when I see one, even a well-disguised one. That meant somebody out here cared enough about who came and went to invest in surveillance, which meant this wasn't just an old grazing lease nobody bothered with anymore. I stood there a second too long, aware all at once that if the camera worked, it had already logged me standing there, staring at it like an idiot who just told on herself. I backed off the fence line and cut wide around where I guess the camera's field of view ended, moving the way I do when I'm trying not to spook wildlife. Slow, low, deliberate about where my boots landed. About 200 yards further, I started noticing rock cairns spaced at even intervals, too regular to be trail markers and too deliberate to be coincidence, like somebody had measured the distance between them with a tape. They didn't point anywhere useful that I could tell. They just marked a line, the way a fence marks a line, except softer, quieter, easier to miss if you weren't already looking for things that didn't belong. I started photographing them on my phone without really deciding to, some instinct telling me I might need proof of what I'd seen out here. The shed was the thing that finally made my stomach drop instead of just tighten. It sat low in a stand of juniper, sided in the same weather gray as everything else out here, easy to miss unless the afternoon light hit the metal roof just right, which it did while I was standing there wondering if I'd wandered somewhere I really shouldn't have. It had a padlock on the door, newer than the building, and a small window up high barred. Not decoratively, actually barred, iron rods bolted into the frame. A shed doesn't need bars on its windows to keep tools in. It needs bars to keep something or someone from getting out. And once that thought landed in my head, I couldn't make it leave again, no matter how many boring explanations I tried to build around it. I made myself walk the perimeter of the shed instead of just standing there imagining things. And that's when I found the objects that stopped being ambiguous. Half buried near the foundation, weathered but not ancient, was a nylon backpack strap, snapped clean through, the kind that comes stock on the cheap packs outfitters rent to tourists. A few feet further, tangled in a creosote bush, a hair tie, faded purple, sun-bleached but clearly not decades old, and half sunk in the dirt by the doorstep. A keychain with a hotel fob still attached, the plastic scratched but legible enough to read an Alamosa Motel's logo. None of that belonged to ranch work. None of that belonged to anybody who meant to leave these things behind on purpose. I heard the engine before I saw anything, a low four-wheeler grind coming from a direction I hadn't explored yet, and I dropped behind a juniper without fully deciding to, my body making the call faster than my brain could argue with it. A man came around the fence line on an ATV, moving unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and had used every bit of it before. Older, maybe 60s, sun-weathered in that specific way that comes from decades outdoors rather than a week of vacation. He parked near the shed, unlocked it with an easy familiarity, went inside for maybe 90 seconds, came back out with an empty bucket, and locked the door again behind him, all without once looking rushed or looking around, like he had absolutely nothing in the world to be careful about. I stayed still until the engine sound faded completely, longer than I needed to, honestly, because my legs had gone a little unreliable under me. Every part of my training as a person who spent her life alone in remote places told me the correct move was to leave. Right then, go back to the van, call the BLM or the sheriff or anybody with a badge, and let them sort out the shed with bars on its window. But I also knew what happens to reports like that. A woman says she saw something weird on a hike. Nobody drives 4 hours out to a valley to check a locked shed on private grazing land without more than a hunch. I decided I needed one more piece of something solid before I brought this to anyone, and I told myself that decision was smart instead of what it actually was, which was reckless. On the walk back, I made myself follow a different line than the one I'd used coming in, some half-formed idea about not leaving an obvious trail, and about halfway to the van I passed within sight of that first camera post again. Except now it was aimed a few degrees differently than before, angled toward the exact route I'd taken out. Not the one I was using to leave. Cameras don't adjust themselves. Somebody, somewhere, had either moved it remotely or come back out and repositioned it since that morning, which meant somebody was actively managing what that camera watched in something close to real time. I picked up my pace without meaning to, the kind of walking that isn't quite running but wants to be, and I didn't look back again until the dune field swallowed the scrubland behind me. By the time I got back to the van, the light had gone that flat gold color that means dusk isn't far off, and my hands were shaking just enough that I fumbled my keys twice before I got the door open. I told myself the smart thing to do was pack up at first light and drive straight to cell signal. Get this on record with somebody official before anything else happened. But some stubborn professional corner of my brain argued for one more night of recording first. If that camera and that shed's caretaker were connected to whatever made that rhythmic sound 2 nights back, I wanted it captured clean, not just described secondhand to a bored deputy. I checked my phone out of habit. Still no bars. Same as it had been since I turned off the highway 3 days ago. I set the mic up that night closer to the wash than I probably should have. Maybe 400 yards from a boundary fence instead of the mile of buffer I'd kept before, and I told myself the extra proximity was purely for better audio fidelity. Around 11, the recorder picked up what I'd been chasing since that first strange thump 2 nights back. A woman's voice, low and even, reciting something with the cadence of scripture or ritual, words I couldn't quite make out even at full volume through my headphones. Underneath it, fainter, came a second voice, higher, breaking rhythm in a way the first voice didn't, like someone struggling to keep pace with a script they hadn't agreed to read. Then, mid-syllable, it just stopped, the way a phone call stops when someone hangs up on purpose. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like an interesting mystery and started feeling like something I needed to get away from immediately. I yanked my headphones off like they were on fire, and my first coherent thought was that I didn't want to spend one more minute parked this close to whatever was making that second voice go quiet mid-sentence. I climbed into the driver's seat, keys already in hand, running through the math of driving out at night on an unfamiliar dirt road versus staying put until dawn. I chose driving. I turned the key, and the engine gave one weak, unconvincing turnover sound, then nothing. Not even the click you'd expect from a dead battery, just a kind of tired silence that felt, in that particular moment, deeply personal. I popped the hood with a headlamp clenched between my teeth, hands not quite steady, running through the short list of things I actually know how to fix versus the much longer list of things I don't. Battery terminals looked fine, corrosion-free, tight. I traced the main harness the way a mechanic had shown me once, looking for the obvious stuff, a chewed wire, a disconnected ground, and found, near the starter relay, a connector that wasn't seated all the way, just enough separation to break the circuit without looking deliberately cut. It could have shaken loose on the primitive road's washboard ruts. Easy, that kind of thing happens on rough terrain all the time. It could also have been touched by someone who knew exactly which wire to loosen to keep a stranger's vehicle from leaving in a hurry. I had no way to know which, and both possibilities scared me the same amount. Reseating the connector took maybe 90 seconds, and the engine caught on the second try, which should have felt like relief, and instead felt like a countdown had just restarted somewhere I couldn't see. I sat there with the engine idling, hands on the wheel, running the actual risk calculation instead of the panicked one. An unfamiliar primitive road at night. No guardrails, soft shoulders that could swallow a tire, versus staying parked with the doors locked until first light gave me visibility. I hated both options equally. I chose to stay, which meant killing the engine to save fuel and sitting in the dark listening to my own pulse in my ears, a sound louder than anything my very expensive microphone had caught all week. I did not sleep. I don't think I even really tried. Somewhere around 1 a.m, I noticed a light moving out past the wash, low to the ground and swinging in slow, deliberate arcs, the unmistakable rhythm of someone sweeping a flashlight beam across open ground while they walked. It wasn't erratic like someone lost or curious. It moved like a search pattern, back and forth, methodical, closing distance with my position at a pace that suggested whoever held it wasn't in any particular hurry, because they didn't expect me to be going anywhere. I killed my headlamp, killed the dome light I'd left on without thinking, and sat in a dark that suddenly felt a lot less protective than it had 10 minutes earlier. The light swept once more, maybe 200 yards out, then turned and moved off toward the boundary fence, taking its unhurried search pattern with it. Dawn came the way it always does out there, indifferent and enormous, turning the dune field gold like nothing at all had happened in the dark hours before it. I didn't wait for coffee or a proper breakfast. I broke camp in maybe 11 minutes flat, threw my gear in without its usual careful order, and pointed the van back toward the highway, done pretending I had one more night of field work left in me. About 2 miles down the primitive road, right where it narrowed between a wash and a cut bank, I found a length of dead cottonwood laid squarely across both ruts, too straight and too centered to be a windfall. I sat there a second, engine running, staring at a fallen branch that had apparently chosen the exact width of the road to fall across, and felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. I could see a way around it if I dropped a wheel into the wash, risky on soft ground but doable, or I could get out and move a piece of dead wood that couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds. I chose the second option because it felt more within my control, which tells you something about how badly my judgment had degraded overnight. I got out, walked up to the branch, and saw the drag marks in the dirt leading to it from the brush line, plus a cut end, chainsawed clean, not snapped by wind or weight the way deadfall usually looks. Somebody had cut this branch down somewhere else and dragged it here on purpose, recently, probably sometime in the last few hours while I sat in my van listening to a flashlight sweep the dark. I dropped it off to the side and got back in the van faster than I've moved in years. I made it another 4 miles before I let myself believe I might actually be getting out clean, and that's precisely when the ATV showed up in my mirror, closing distance steadily on a road built for exactly this kind of pursuit and nothing faster. I didn't recognize the rider's face at that distance, didn't need to. The unhurried posture told me everything, the same unbothered calm I'd watched from behind a juniper the day before. I pushed the van faster than the washboard ruts really allowed, feeling the frame rattle in ways that worried me almost as much as the mirror did, and I ran the numbers on distance to pavement against distance he'd need to catch me. Math I had absolutely no confidence in, and no better option than to trust anyway. The primitive road forked about 6 miles from where I'd started, one branch running the rest of the way out to pavement, the other cutting toward the outfitter's base camp where Desmond kept his horses and, more importantly, kept other people around. I had maybe 2 seconds to decide between a longer, lonelier route to a highway I could outdrive on, or a shorter route to a place with witnesses in it, and I chose witnesses without fully thinking it through. because some animal part of my brain understood that being alone was the actual danger here, not the terrain. I hauled the wheel right at the fork hard enough to feel the back end slide in the loose gravel, caught it, and kept my foot down, watching the mirror for a headlight that hadn't shown up yet, but felt like it was owed to me any second. The outfitter's camp sat in a stand of cottonwoods along a side creek, a cluster of tents, and a corral I'd seen from a distance 2 days earlier when Desmond first mentioned it, and I pulled in fast enough to spray gravel across the fire ring. I called his name twice, then a third time, louder, and got nothing back except the horses in the corral shifting and stamping in a way that horses do when something's already spooked them before you showed up. There was a coffee pot on a camp stove, still warm to the touch when I checked a minute later, and a folding chair knocked over on its side in the dirt. The kind of small wrongness that doesn't prove anything on its own, but adds up fast when you're already running on no sleep and too much adrenaline. I found Desmond's handheld radio sitting on an overturned crate near his tent, powered on, static hissing softly from the speaker, which told me he hadn't gone far on purpose. Nobody leaves their only working comms behind willingly out here. I picked it up, keyed the mic, said his name into it twice, and got only that same patient static in return. No answer. No click of someone listening on the other end. Behind me, faint but unmistakable, I heard the ATV engine again, closer now than it had been on the road, close enough that I understood it had followed me off the primitive road, and on a ground it clearly knew as well as its own driveway. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to run for the tree line or hold my ground in a camp that at least had somebody's belongings scattered around it. He came around the cottonwoods on the ATV at that same unhurried pace, cut the engine maybe 20 feet from where I stood, and swung off it like a man arriving at his own porch rather than someone else's camp. "You must be the recording lady," he said, pleasant as anything, like we'd been introduced at a potluck instead of a shed with bars on its window. He told me his name was Garrett, said he leased the grazing rights up past the boundary and helped Desmond out sometimes with fencing and water lines, and that Desmond had mentioned heading up to check the north pasture fence that morning. Ought to be back any time now. Every sentence he said was reasonable on its own, strung together, aimed at me specifically. They felt like a story built to fit whatever I already knew, which meant he'd guessed correctly that I knew something. I told him my van had been giving me starter trouble, true enough as far as it went, and he offered right away to take a look at it. Said he kept a toolkit on the ATV for exactly the kind of thing out here. I declined as politely as I could manage, said I'd already gotten it running and didn't want to jinx it, which was a lie built directly on top of the truth to keep him from getting anywhere near my engine bay again. Up close, I noticed his hands were clean in a way that didn't match the rest of him. No grease, no calluses consistent with the fencing work he'd just described. And strapped to the back of his ATV, half covered by a tarp, sat a coil of the same nylon rope you'd use to secure a load, or something else depending on what you needed rope for out here. He asked, easy as small talk, whether I'd gotten any good recordings the past few nights, whether the wind out past the dune field had given me anything interesting, and I understood the question wasn't really about wind at all. I told him mostly just ambient noise, nothing usable yet, boring stuff, and watched him nod like he'd expected exactly that answer and had already decided what to do regardless of what I'd said. He mentioned Desmond a second time, unprompted, said the man was reliable, always turned up eventually, said it in a tone that was somehow both reassuring and a warning, like he wanted me to hear both meanings and choose which one to believe. I chose to believe neither, but I nodded along like a person who trusted every word coming out of his mouth. That's when I caught the movement at the edge of my vision, past Garrett's shoulder, at a battered travel trailer tucked at the tree lean I hadn't clocked as part of this camp until just then. A curtain shifted in one small window, just enough to suggest a hand had been there a half second before, and behind the glass, for less than a breath, I saw the pale outline of a face looking straight at me before the curtain fell back into place. Garrett didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He'd clearly already known exactly what was in that trailer and exactly how visible it was from where I stood, and the fact that he let me see it anyway told me more about how little he feared me leaving here than anything he'd actually said out loud. Every instinct telling me to get back in my van and drive until I hit pavement ran straight into the fact that I'd just seen a face in a window that had no business being locked in a trailer on a working horse camp. I couldn't unsee it, and I couldn't pretend the math had stayed the same as it was 5 minutes earlier, back when this was only about my own skin. I kept my expression as flat as I could manage, told Garrett I needed to grab something from my van, and walked back toward it at a pace I hoped read as casual instead of the barely contained sprint my legs actually wanted to execute, running through every version of a plan that didn't end with me leaving that person behind. At the van, I fumbled my phone out and got 2 photos of the trailer and Garrett's ATV before I made myself stop, aware that every second spent documenting was a second he could notice from wherever he stood. I tried texting Priya again, a single line: "If you don't hear from me by tonight, call the sheriff. Great Sand Dunes, Medano Pass," and watched the little red exclamation mark appear next to it. Undelivered, exactly like every other message I tried since I turned off the highway. I popped my hood again for show, buying time, running my hands over an engine that already worked fine, listening for the ATV's idle to change pitch behind me, for anything that would tell me whether the next few minutes were the ones that mattered most in my entire life. I heard the second engine before Garrett did. Or maybe he heard it just as fast and simply didn't let his face move, because by the time Desmond's truck and horse trailer rolled into camp, dust rising behind it in a long gold column, Garrett had already turned to watch it arrive with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything else. Desmond climbed out looking tired but whole, said something about a down section of fence up in the north pasture, taking longer than expected, exactly the story Garrett had told me an hour earlier, word for word close enough that it could have been true or could have been rehearsed. I didn't know which yet. I only knew that for the first time since that flashlight swept the dark the night before, I wasn't the only person standing in this camp who might actually be on my side. I found an excuse to walk past Desmond while he unloaded his horse, close enough to drop my voice below anything Garrett could hear from the corral, and said just 4 words: "There's someone in the trailer." Desmond's face didn't change much, which either meant he already knew or he was better at hiding surprise than Garrett was. And for one terrible second, I couldn't tell which. He told me, just as quiet, to get in my van and act like I was leaving, then circle back on foot from the creekside once Garrett headed up toward the north pasture like he usually did this time of evening. It wasn't much of a plan. It was the only one either of us had, and I nodded like it was enough. I drove out the way I'd come in, gravel popping under the tires, and made myself hold that speed for a full mile before I pulled off into a stand of willows along the creek and cut the engine, exactly like we planned. Walking back on foot took longer than I wanted, boots filling with creek water at one crossing, mud sucking at my heels at another, my breath loud in my own ears in a way it never usually is when I'm working, because usually I'm not scared while I'm working. The light was going that same gold color it always did out here right before dusk, gorgeous and completely indifferent, and I hated a little for looking so calm while my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I reached the tree line above camp just as the ATV engine started up again, and I made myself stay still and count to 60 after the sound faded north before I trusted it enough to move, my heart running well ahead of my own good judgment the whole time. Desmond was waiting near the trailer when I came down out of the willows, a crowbar in one hand that he'd clearly pulled from somewhere in his truck bed, his usual easy expression gone entirely, replaced by something tighter and older looking than I'd seen on it before. He didn't say much, just nodded toward the trailer door and the padlock holding it shut, and I understood without being told that whatever came next, we were doing it fast. The crowbar took 2 hard pulls to snap the hasp, loud enough in that quiet camp that I felt the sound in my teeth, and then the door swung open on a smell of stale air and unwashed fabric that told me most of what I needed to know before my eyes adjusted to the dark inside. She was younger than me by a decade at least, curled on a thin mattress with her wrists zip-tied in front of her, blinking against the sudden light like something that had forgotten daylight was a regular occurrence. She didn't scream. She just said, in a voice worn down to almost nothing, "Are you real?" And I told her yes twice before I trusted my own voice enough to say anything else. Desmond cut the zip ties with a pocket knife while I got an arm under her shoulders, and she came up off that mattress lighter than she should have been, the kind of light that comes from a body that's been rationed rather than fed. She said her name was Adair, said she'd been picked up hitchhiking outside Alamosa, which she thought was maybe 3 weeks back, though her sense of time had clearly slipped its mooring somewhere in that trailer. She said one more thing before we got her moving, quiet, almost to herself, that she hadn't been the first one in that trailer, that there were marks on the wall from someone before her she didn't want to count. Neither of us answered that. There wasn't an answer that would have helped either of us right then. We didn't make it to the tree line before the ATV came back into earshot, faster now than its usual patient crawl, which told me Garrett had either finished early or realized something was wrong before we were ready for him to. Desmond shoved Adair and me toward the willows and told us to keep moving no matter what happened behind us. And I heard, rather than saw, the confrontation that followed. Raised voices, a scuffle, a sound I didn't examine too closely because examining it would have meant stopping, and stopping wasn't an option anymore. Adair could barely run, so I half carried her the last stretch to where I'd left the van, hands shaking too hard to get the key into the ignition on the first try, or the second, while behind us the sounds from the direction we'd come from didn't stop, didn't slow down. The engine caught on the first reel, try that mattered. And I put the van in gear and didn't look in the mirror even once until we'd covered enough ground that looking back stopped feeling like tempting fate. I drove the primitive road faster than any sane person should, blew past the entrance station without stopping. Adair slumped against the passenger window somewhere between conscious and not, and didn't slow down again until I hit a stretch of highway with actual cell bars lighting up my phone screen for the first time in 4 days. I called 911 from the shoulder of Highway 17, gave the dispatcher everything I had, Adair's name, the camp's rough location, Garrett's name, the shed, the trailer, all of it tumbling out faster than she could apparently type. And only after I hung up did I let myself wonder what had actually happened to Desmond back there. What the sheriff's department found out there, 3 days later with a warrant and a small convoy of vehicles, was a compound mostly stripped bare, the shed empty, the trailer's mattress gone, tire tracks heading off toward BLM land that never quite led anywhere conclusive. Garrett, if that was even his real name, didn't turn up in any database they checked, and the grazing lease on file belonged to a corporation that had dissolved on paper years earlier. They found Desmond a half-mile from camp, alive, banged up bad enough for a hospital stay, but he wouldn't say much about what happened in those minutes after he sent Adair and me running. Not to the deputies, not to me on the one visit I made before I left the valley, just that Garrett hadn't gone down easy and hadn't exactly gone down at all, as far as anyone could confirm. I'm back in Denver now, technically fine, technically employed, technically sleeping through most nights the way a normal person does. Adair's staying with family in Pueblo, and we talk sometimes, careful, unfinished conversations that never quite get to the parts either of us actually wants to discuss. Every so often, usually late, my phone rings from a block number, and when I answer there's nothing on the line, but a kind of static that sounds, if I let myself think about it too long, uncomfortably like wind moving across an open valley floor. I tell myself it's nothing, a robocall glitch, bad cell infrastructure, the ordinary garbage that clutters every phone in America. I haven't gone back to the San Luis Valley since, and I don't plan to, but I still haven't deleted that first recording, the one with the thump in it, and some nights I think about why that is. Name's Emery Castellan, 51 years old, and until 6 years ago I was an Army combat medic, 3 deployments, discharged with a bad knee and a worse relationship with sleep. These days I drive around Colorado in a decommissioned ambulance I gutted and rebuilt myself, which strikes most people as either brilliant or deeply unwell, and I've stopped arguing about which. I've got one daughter, Petra, 24, living in Fort Collins, and we talk on the phone in these careful, 10-minute increments that never quite get anywhere, the kind of conversation two people have when they both know there's a longer one waiting underneath it. This particular trip wasn't really about camping. It was about my grandfather, Silas, who trained right here at Camp Hale with the 10th Mountain Division back in 1943, and a leather journal of his I'd never worked up the nerve to read all the way through. Camp Hale sits in a high, narrow valley off Tennessee Pass, north of Leadville, at an elevation that makes you feel your pulse before you've done anything to earn it. Most of what was actually built here got demolished decades back. It was a proper Army post once, barracks, mess halls, a whole town's worth of infrastructure. So what's left now is concrete foundations poking up through the willows like bad teeth, and informational signs explaining what used to stand where you're currently standing. There's also, and I want to be clear, I'm not exaggerating this, actual unexploded ordnance risk zones marked off with fencing and warnings, decades-old shells the Army never fully accounted for. I found that detail almost funny in a grim way. A place this beautiful, still capable of killing you on a technicality, 70 years after anybody stopped trying. I parked in a pullout along the old Cantonment Road, close enough to walk the ruins in the morning, and went through my evening routine, which after 6 years of practice runs like a checklist whether I want it to or not. Perimeter check. Exits clear. A weapon I don't carry anymore, reach for out of habit before I remember I sold it 2 years back. Sleep's never come easy for me. Not since the last deployment. And I've made a kind of peace with lying awake most nights doing math in my head, just to have something to occupy the hours. That first night at Camp Hale, I read 3 pages of Silas's journal by headlamp, his handwriting cramped and formal, describing snow up to his chest, and an officer who worked them like the mountain itself was the enemy. I fell asleep somewhere around page 4, journal still open on my chest. I met the man everybody just called Dutch the next morning, filling water at the same trickling spring I'd found on a Park Service map. He was maybe 70, weathered in a way that made his exact age hard to pin down, driving an old pickup with a camper shell held together with what looked like faith and duct tape. He'd been coming to Camp Hale on and off for years, he said, doing some kind of informal research into the old cantonment layout. Though he got vague fast when I asked what kind. He had a way of answering questions with just enough information to seem forthcoming while somehow telling you nothing at all. A skill I recognized because I'd used it myself plenty of times, usually to keep people from asking about things I didn't want to explain. When I mentioned my grandfather's unit, Dutch's whole demeanor shifted, got warmer, more specific. He knew details about the 10th Mountains training here that weren't on any of the interpretive signs. Talked about ski maneuvers and mule trains like he'd read every book ever written on the subject. He offered to show me some of the foundations further off the marked trail. Said the Park Service map only covered maybe a third of what actually used to be out here. I noticed, though, that when I asked how long he usually stayed at a stretch, his eyes went somewhere else for a second, somewhere that had nothing to do with our conversation, before he answered with a number that felt rounded down from the truth. We spent that first afternoon walking a loop of concrete foundations that used to be barracks, Dutch narrating like a man who'd given this tour before, maybe to himself. He told me things I hadn't read in Silas's journal. How after the war, the Army quietly used Camp Hale again in the late 50s, training foreign fighters for operations the government never officially acknowledged, before the whole program got shut down and mostly forgotten by everybody except the handful of historians who still argue about the details. I like that Dutch didn't dumb any of it down for me. Treated me like someone capable of holding complicated history without needing it simplified. It made the vague parts of his own story easier to overlook, at least for that first day. Off the main loop, tucked behind a stand of spruce that didn't look like it had ever had a trail cut through it, I spotted a fire ring. Not old, not historical, ash still gray instead of weathered white, with a rough marker driven in the ground beside it, a piece of rebar bent into something like a symbol I didn't recognize. I pointed it out to Dutch, expecting some easy explanation, another elk hunter or backcountry camper. Instead, he went quiet for a second too long, said something about squatters being a problem in the area sometimes, and steered us back toward the main loop with a firmness that didn't match the easy, professorial tone he'd used all afternoon. I filed the shift away without saying anything about it. Back at my own site that evening, I got 1 bar of signal long enough to leave Petra a voicemail, told her about the journal, about a valley that still had live ordnance buried in it 80 years later, try to make it sound like the kind of thing she'd find interesting instead of the kind of thing that was actually keeping me up. I read another page of Silas's journal after that, a passage about how the mountain played tricks on a man's eyes at dusk, made shapes out of nothing, taught you not to trust your own senses after enough sleepless nights at altitude. I remember thinking, at the time, that it felt like useful advice for a man on a camping trip. I didn't yet understand how literally I'd need to take it. Sometime after midnight, lying in the back of the ambulance with the journal closed on my chest the same as the night before, I heard something that didn't fit the valley's usual inventory of night sounds. Not wind, not an animal, something with rhythm to it, evenly spaced, like footsteps set to a pace a lot more deliberate than wildlife ever bothers with. I lay still and listened for longer than I want to admit, medic training arguing with old deployment instinct about whether this was worth getting up for. When I finally looked out the back window, I caught, just for a second, a point of orange light flare and die out in the direction of that off-trail fire ring, exactly where Dutch had rushed us away from that afternoon. I didn't mention the light to Dutch over coffee the next morning, mostly because I didn't trust my own account of it yet. 4 days of bad sleep at 9,000 feet will manufacture all sorts of things a man swears he saw. But medic training teaches you to distrust your own certainty until you've actually assessed the wound, so to speak, and that instinct sent me back toward that stand of spruce alone that afternoon, while Dutch was off doing whatever he did with his mornings, which he'd never actually specified. I told myself I was just going to look, document what I found, maybe get a photo of that strange bent rebar marker for my own satisfaction. I didn't tell myself what I'd do if I found more than that. The fire ring had been used again since Dutch, and I passed it, fresh ash on top of the gray, and a boot print pressed into softer ground beside it that didn't match the tread on my own boots, or, as far as I could tell, on Dutch's. A few yards off, half hidden under a fallen branch, I found a plastic tote with a tight lid, and inside it canned goods, a hand crank radio, and a spiral notebook gone soft with damp, pages covered in handwriting too cramped and careful for me to make sense of at a glance. Somebody wasn't just passing through this valley. Somebody had a whole supply cache tucked here, maintained, restocked, the kind of setup that takes months or years to build, not days. I opened the notebook against my better judgment, and the first legible page stopped me cold. Dates going back at least 6 years. Entries in a clipped, military shorthand. I recognized the rhythm of even though the content made less and less sense the further I read. Sightings logged like patrol reports. References to infiltrators moving through sector lines that didn't correspond to anything on a modern map. More like an old cantonment grid superimposed over the present-day valley. One entry, dated maybe 8 months back, just said, in careful block letters, held the line again, followed by a tally mark, the kind of mark somebody keeps when they've stopped counting days and started counting something else entirely. I put the notebook back exactly where I'd found it, lid pressed down the same amount, tote nudged back under its branch at the same angle, an old habit from scenes where you learn not to disturb anything until somebody with more authority than you shows up to document it properly. Walking back toward camp, I ran through how I wanted to bring this up with Dutch, because something about his reaction to that fire ring the day before told me he already knew more than he'd said, and I wanted to give him room to tell me the truth without feeling cornered into it. I've handled enough scared, guarded people in the field to know cornering somebody rarely gets you the honest version of anything. I brought it up over Dutch's camp stove that evening, kept it light at first, said I'd found an old supply cache out past the spruce, and wondered if he knew whose it was. His face did something complicated, somewhere between resignation and worry, before he admitted, carefully, that there was somebody who'd been living rough out in that section of the valley for years, that the old-timers and a few rangers he knew called him the Colonel, half rumor and half established fact by that point. He said it the way you'd mention a mountain lion that's been seen in the area a few too many times to be coincidence. Real enough to respect, vague enough that nobody quite agreed on the details. Dutch's working theory, which he offered like a man who'd turned it over plenty of times already, was that the Colonel had some family connection to the original training program, maybe a relative who never fully readjusted after their own service and eventually just stayed or came back, and that decades alone at altitude do things to a mind that nobody plans for. He told me to stick to marked trails from here on, cited the unexploded ordnance risk as his official reason, which was true enough on its own merits. But underneath that practical warning, I heard something closer to real fear, the kind that comes from first-hand knowledge rather than second-hand rumor. I asked him, straight out, if he'd ever actually seen the man. He took a long time answering that one. Eventually he said, quiet, that he'd seen somebody out past the wire a few years back, at dusk, close enough to know it wasn't an elk or a hallucination, but far enough that he couldn't swear to details beyond a shape in old fatigues moving with a purpose that had nothing lost or confused about it. He didn't offer more than that. And when I tried to ask a follow-up question, he changed the subject to the weather with a bluntness that told me the conversation was over whether I liked it or not. It was the first time since I'd met him that Dutch's easy, professorial calm cracked enough for me to see something underneath it, and what I saw looked a lot like a man still working through fear he hadn't fully processed. That night, I didn't fall asleep pretending the valley was quiet. I lay in the back of the ambulance with the rear doors locked, a flashlight and the tire iron I keep for actual emergencies within reach, listening for that same, evenly spaced sound from 2 nights before. It came back around 1 a.m, closer this time, close enough that I could make out an actual cadence to it. Footsteps, unhurried, moving along what might have been the old cantonment road rather than through brush, like whoever was prefer the ease of a road that had technically stopped existing decades ago. I didn't get up. I didn't shine the light out the window. I just lay there, counting the steps, until they passed by and faded off toward the section of Valley Dutch had told me to stay out of. By morning, I decided the responsible thing to do was drive to the ranger station at the edge of the monument and report what I'd found. The cache, the notebook, footsteps on a road that wasn't supposed to have anybody on it at 1 a.m. When I floated that plan to Dutch over coffee, he pushed back harder than I expected. Said rangers had already looked into rumors like this before and never found anything solid enough to act on. Said reporting it now, with nothing but a notebook and some footsteps, would just get us both written off as over-imaginative campers who'd spent too long at altitude. I got the sense he wasn't just worried about being disbelieved. I got the sense he was worried about what might happen, to him specifically, if word got out that he'd known about this for years and said nothing. We settled on a compromise I wasn't fully comfortable with. One more look together, in daylight, at whatever lay past the section of Valley Dutch had been steering me away from, before we decided anything about rangers or reports. He said if we were going to drag officials into this, he wanted to know exactly what we were dragging them into. And honestly, some stubborn part of me agreed with that logic, even though a smarter part of me knew it was exactly the kind of reasoning that gets people hurt in slow, preventable ways. We set out mid-morning, sticking to what remained of the old cantonment road, Dutch quieter than I'd seen him yet, checking his own footing like a man who'd rather be anywhere else and had decided to go anyway. The terrain changed the further we went, foundations giving way to less obvious ruins. Collapsed timber, rusted pipe fittings half buried in willow thickets, the kind of debris that doesn't show up on any interpretive map because nobody's bothered cataloging it in decades. The official unexploded ordnance warning signs, so prominent near the parking areas, thinned out to almost nothing back here, which felt less like safety and more like the absence of anybody bothering to survey ground this far off the beaten path. Dutch mentioned, almost offhand, that the danger didn't go away just because the signs did, and I believed him, the way you believe anyone who sounds more tired than dramatic when they say something that should probably scare you. About a mile past where the signage stopped, we found a campsite that had been abandoned mid-use. A tent still half-staked, one guy line snapped rather than untied, a camp chair knocked flat, and a cook pot with the remains of a meal gone dry and cracked inside it. Nothing about it looked like a normal breakdown of camp, the unhurried packing up most people do even in bad weather. It looked like somebody had left in the middle of doing something ordinary and never come back to finish it. My medic brain, trained to read scenes for what they implied about the people who'd been in them, kept circling one detail, a smear of something dark on the tent's nylon wall, old enough to have browned, too irregular to be mud. Dutch went very still looking at that tent, and when I asked if he recognized it, he admitted, low, that it matched the description of a backcountry permit holder who'd gone missing from this section of the monument almost 4 years back. A hiker named Ansel Brower, 34, experienced the kind of disappearance that got a brief search effort and then quietly folded into the file of cases the Forest Service marks unresolved and mostly stops actively pursuing. Dutch said he'd suspected, even back then, that Ansel's disappearance had something to do with the rumors he'd already been hearing about somebody living out past the wire, but he'd never had anything solid enough to bring to anyone, and by the time he did, he said, he'd already convinced himself it was too late to matter. I didn't have the energy to be angry at Dutch about it, not standing in a dead man's abandoned campsite with afternoon light slanting through willows that suddenly felt a lot less scenic than they had an hour earlier. I told him what mattered now wasn't what he should have done 4 years ago, it was what we did in the next hour, and that meant photographing everything exactly as we'd found it and getting back to a ranger station before dark. No more compromises, no more one more looks. He nodded, quiet, and helped me document the site with a kind of grim, practice care that told me this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this either, even if he'd never admit to the specifics. We were maybe 2 minutes from leaving when I heard something thrashing weakly in a thicket off to our left, a sound with enough distress in it that my training overrode every ounce of caution I'd built up over the past 2 days. Dutch grabbed my arm, said to leave it, but I've spent too many years unable to walk past something hurt, animal or otherwise, and I pushed into the brush before he could argue me out of it. What I found was a coyote, One hind leg caught in a wire snare rig with more skill than any legal trap I'd ever seen. The kind of setup that suggested somebody out here knew exactly what they were doing with cable and tension, and had been doing a long time. I got the wire loose enough to free the leg, more out of reflex than any real plan, while Dutch stood watch with an expression that told me he thought I'd lost my mind bothering with the coyote, given everything else we'd found that day. As I straightened up, I noticed the ground around the snare, boot prints, several sets overlapping, some old and weathered, some pressed fresh enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet, circling the trap in a pattern that made it clear somebody checked this line regularly, probably more than once a week. Which meant, unless we'd gotten extraordinarily lucky with timing, whoever maintained that snare had likely been through this exact spot sometime that same day. We started back the way we'd come, faster now, and about 10 minutes and I realized the landscape wasn't matching my memory of the walkout. A rock formation I was certain we'd passed on our left now sat on our right, and a fork in the old road that I'd have sworn didn't exist an hour ago forced us to guess which branch led back toward the marked trail system. Dutch admitted, tight-voiced, that some of the old Cantonment Road forks looked identical enough to trick even people who knew the area well, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something less innocent than bad memory was at work, especially with the light starting to slant gold and thin the way it does right before a mountain valley loses the sun completely. We picked the left fork on nothing more than a guess and Dutch's half-remembered instinct. Moving fast now, both of us done pretending this was still a documentation exercise instead of something closer to an evacuation. The light kept dropping fast the way it does at altitude, shadows pooling in the willow thickets until the whole valley started to look uniformly dark rather than lit in patches. And somewhere behind us, not far enough behind us, I heard that same evenly spaced footfall from 2 nights running. Except now, it wasn't background noise drifting past my campsite. Now it was closing distance, on ground where I no longer had any real confidence about which direction actually led out. We stuck together, which in hindsight was probably the only decision that day that didn't require debating, moving fast along the fork we'd chosen with the footfalls somewhere behind us, keeping a pace that matched ours a little too precisely for comfort. The fork dead-ended, not at the marked trail system we'd hoped for, but at a slope of loose scree leading up to what looked, at first glance, like just another collapsed foundation. Closer up, though, the collapse was staged, timber braced deliberately over what had clearly once been a proper bunker entrance, reinforced with scavenged rebar and a door that, despite everything around it looking abandoned for decades, hung on hinges somebody had clearly oiled within the past few months. With the light nearly gone and that pace behind us showing no sign of slowing or reconsidering, hiding in a defensible structure suddenly looked better than standing exposed on open scree. So we made the call to duck inside, hoping for either a place to wait out whoever was following or, better, some second exit that would let us circle back toward the marked trails without crossing paths with them all. The door swung open easier than its rust-streaked exterior suggested it should, and the air inside came out cool and close, carrying a smell of kerosene and old canvas that told me somebody spent real time down here, not just passing through, not just checking snares on a schedule. The space inside was small, low-ceilinged, lit by a single battery lantern somebody had left burning, and outfitted with the kind of careful, minimal order I recognized from long deployments. A cot made with military corners, a shelf of canned goods stacked by size, an old crank radio identical to the one in the cache we'd found earlier that day. What stopped me cold wasn't the order. It was a row of personal items lined up along a shelf like a kind of ledger, a hiking permit tag, a woman's watch, a set of car keys with a rental company's fob still attached, none of it belonging to whoever kept this cot, so precisely made, all of it belonging, almost certainly, to people who hadn't walked back out of this valley. Among the items on that shelf sat a laminated permit tag with a name I already knew from an hour earlier standing in an abandoned tent. Ansel Brouwer, the same hiker Dutch had recognized, the same disappearance that had gone cold and quiet for 4 years, while whoever kept this bunker kept adding to a shelf nobody official had ever known to look for. Dutch made a sound when he saw it that wasn't quite a word, more like something giving way inside him all at once, for years of suspicion turning, in a single second, in a confirmation he clearly hadn't wanted as badly as he told himself he did. I didn't have time to manage his grief for him. The footfalls outside had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them get closer. Silence, in a situation like that, isn't relief. It's just a different, worse kind of information. And I spent the next several seconds doing the math every medic learns to do without meaning to. Last known position, likely speed, probable intent, while scanning the bunker's low walls for anything resembling a second way out. Dutch found it first, a narrow service tunnel at the back, half collapsed but passable if we went single file, and didn't mind our shoulders scraping concrete the whole way through. I didn't love the idea of trading one confined space for an even more confined one, but standing still in a room full of a stranger's collected proof of harm wasn't exactly the safer option either. So I gestured him forward and followed close behind. The tunnel ran maybe 40 feet, low enough that we duck-walked most of it, concrete dust coating my hands and knees, sound doing strange muffled things in that confined space that made it impossible to tell whether the noises I heard were coming from ahead, behind, or just my own blood in my ears. It led out through a collapsed grate into a shallow ravine I didn't recognize from our walk-in, close enough to a tree line that I could make out, past the branches, the pale cut of what looked like an actual maintained trail, closer to the monument's marked system than I'd dared hope. Dutch went through first, and I followed, grateful for open air in a way I don't think I'd ever fully appreciated before that exact moment. We made it maybe 30 yards from the grate when he stepped out from behind a boulder ahead of us instead of coming from behind, which told me he'd known this ground well enough to circle around while we were still crawling through a tunnel he'd probably built himself. He was older than Dutch, dressed in fatigues gone soft and mismatched with decades of patching, and he held himself with a kind of upright, disciplined stillness that had nothing frail about it despite his age. He asked us, in a flat, procedural voice, for our unit designation, like the question made perfect sense, like the war he was still fighting had never once considered ending. Dutch, beside me, went very quiet in a way that told me he understood exactly how serious this actually was. I answered him the way you answer someone mid-crisis when the truth won't help and a lie might get you killed faster. Calm, simple, a designation that meant nothing but sounded like it belonged in his framework, the same voice I used to use talking down soldiers deep in their own worst moments. He studied me for a long few seconds, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been recognition of a fellow serviceman, or might have been nothing but the mechanics of a mind running old patterns on new input, and I genuinely couldn't tell which. Dutch shifted his weight beside me, and the colonel's attention snapped to him instantly, sharp, suspicious, like Dutch's hesitation had failed some test mine had barely passed. Whatever thin thread had been holding the moment together snapped the instant the colonel decided Dutch didn't belong in whatever unit he'd assigned us to in his head, and he closed the distance between them faster than a man his age had any right to move, hand already closing around something at his belt that I didn't wait around to identify. I got a shoulder into him half a second after he made contact with Dutch, more instinct than plan, and the three of us went down together into the scree in a tangle of limbs and old fatigues and Dutch's genuinely frightened shout, the kind of sound I hadn't heard a grown man make in a long time. And the last coherent thought I had before everything became purely physical was that I hoped whatever training I still had left in my hands was enough. The scuffle didn't last as long as it felt like it did. Maybe 15 seconds of genuine chaos before old training took over, and I managed to get a controlling grip on the colonel's wrist, the same joint lock I'd use a dozen times overseas on people thrashing through fear or fentanyl, or both, more interested in containing the threat than ending it. He fought harder than his age suggested he should be able to, wiry and desperate in a way that had nothing performative about it, and it took bracing my full weight against him before he stopped straining and went, abruptly, limp with exhaustion rather than surrender. Dutch was on the ground a few feet off, one hand pressed to his opposite forearm, blood dark between his fingers, not gushing, not arterial, but real, and his face had gone the particular gray I'd learned to take seriously. I kept one knee on the colonel's shoulder, enough pressure to remind him without hurting him more than necessary, and talked Dutch through breathing while I got a look at the cut. Clean, not deep enough to hit anything vital, the kind of wound that looks worse than it is if you know what you're checking for. I pulled my belt off and used it as a rough pressure wrap, told Dutch he was going to be fine in the specific flat tone I used to use on soldiers who needed to believe me more than they needed the truth, and felt the colonel shift under my knee, testing the pressure, gauging whether I'd relaxed enough yet to make another move worth attempting. Somewhere in the middle of getting Dutch stabilized, the colonel started talking low, almost to himself, fragments that didn't always connect, a unit designation that matched records from the original 10th Mountain training, a name that might have been his own or might have been somebody else's entirely, something about holding a line because nobody had ever formally told him to stop. I couldn't tell, kneeling there with my belt cinched around another man's arm, whether I was restraining an aging veteran who genuinely lost decades to an untreated wound nobody had ever properly closed, or something closer to a legend that had simply outlived the true story it started from. Both possibilities felt equally sad, and neither one made me any less aware of the shelf of belongings back in that bunker. I'm not in the business of deciding what happens to a man like that. Not out here, not with a belt for a tourniquet and no real backup coming anytime soon. So I made the call to secure him as best I could with what we had. Dutch's own belt for his wrists, lashed to a fixed boulder, tight enough to hold, loose enough that I could tell myself I wasn't leaving him to lose circulation entirely. He didn't fight the restraint the way I expected. He'd gone somewhere distant again, muttering that same unit designation, and something about watching a person go quiet like that, rather than raging, sat heavier on me than the fighting had a few minutes earlier. Getting Dutch moving took longer than either of us wanted, his color still bad, his steps careful in a way that told me the adrenaline was wearing off faster than his body could compensate for it, and I kept one hand under his good arm the entire way, half supporting his weight while scanning the terrain for the trail I'd glimpsed through the treeline earlier. It took the better part of an hour to cover what should have been a 20-minute walk, full dark by the time we hit the actual marked trail system, headlamps finally useful instead of a liability, and another 40 minutes after that before the lights of the trailhead parking area came into view, ordinary and fluorescent, and more welcome than almost anything I'd ever seen in my life. I called it in from the trailhead, gave the dispatcher coordinates as close as I could estimate, mentioned Dutch's injury, the bunker, the shelf of belongings, everything, and within 2 hours the parking area looked like a small staging ground for search and rescue and county sheriff's deputies both. Dutch went out by ambulance, stable, stitched, expected to recover fully from a wound that could have gone much worse. When a search team finally located the bunker and the boulder where I'd left the colonel restrained, sometime after midnight, they found the belt cut clean through with something sharp and no sign of the man himself anywhere in the immediate search radius, despite dogs, despite thermal imaging, despite every resource the county could throw at a search area that large. Over the following days, investigators matched enough of what we'd found to reopen Ansel Brower's case formally, along with at least 2 other disappearances from the monuments files that had gone cold over the past decade, though nobody could say for certain how many more that shelf might have represented before we found it. As for the colonel himself, record searches turned up a partial match to a 10th Mountain veteran, officially listed as deceased almost 30 years earlier, an identification nobody could fully confirm or rule out, given how little remained to compare against beyond fragments of a story a frightened, exhausted man had muttered while I knelt on his shoulder in the dark. The file, as far as I understand it, remains open. Nobody I spoke with expected it to close anytime soon. I called Petra properly once I was home, not a voicemail this time, an actual conversation that ran almost an hour, longer than any call we'd managed in over a year, and I told her more of it than I probably should have, though she didn't ask me to stop. Before I left the monument for good, I drove back out to the main interpretive area, the safe, marked, thoroughly surveyed part of Camp Hale, and left Silas's dog tags, the actual metal ones, not just the journal, at the base of a memorial marker dedicated to the 10th Mountain Division, figuring he'd earned that more than I'd earned carrying them around as some kind of talisman against a valley that clearly didn't care whose grandfather trained there. I still don't sleep much better than I used to, which I've mostly made peace with, but there's a new specific thing that happens now, every so often, usually on quiet roads at dusk when the light goes that particular thin gold. I'll hear or think I hear an evenly spaced footfall somewhere just outside whatever I'm currently parked in, unhurried, deliberate, the exact cadence I first heard outside that ambulance at Camp Hale. I tell myself it's an old deployment habit finally catching up with me at a strange angle, a trauma response with nothing behind it but my own overtrained ears. I mostly believe that, but I've started checking my perimeter twice again before I sleep anywhere new, same as I used to, and some nights, twice doesn't feel like quite enough. My name is Solveig Marchetti, 33, and I'm 5 years into a geology PhD. I sometimes joke I'll finish sometime around retirement age if the funding holds out. I specialize in lava tube formation, which means I spend more of my adult life underground than most geologists ever do, mapping systems that formed when basalt flows crusted over on the outside while the molten rock kept moving underneath. My research partner, Jonas Pruitt, 36, has been my rope man and survey partner for 4 field seasons running, ever since we met at a caving conference in Bend and discovered we had the same unfashionable obsession with obscure basalt tube systems nobody else wanted funding to study. This trip took us to Lava Beds National Monument, tucked into the far northeast corner of California, home to more than 800 mapped lava tube caves, and we'd soon learn, at least a few that weren't mapped at all. Lava Beds doesn't look like much from the entrance road. Flat scrubland, juniper, low ridges of black rock that used to be rivers of fire, until you learn what's underneath it. A honeycomb of tubes running for miles beneath a landscape that gives almost nothing away on the surface. The monument holds real history beyond the geology, too. In the winter of 1872, a small band of Modoc people held off a U.S. Army force many times their size for months, using the lava bed's natural maze as a fortress, a place called Captain Jack's Stronghold that's still marked and walkable today. Standing at the trailhead, reading the interpretive sign, I remember thinking that any landscape capable of hiding people that effectively from an entire army was a landscape worth taking seriously, and not just as an interesting footnote for a lecture slide. We set up at Indian Well Campground, the monument's one developed site, close enough to the visitor center that we still had decent cell signal. A small mercy, given how much of our actual field work happened somewhere signal can't follow. Jonas cooked, badly, the same charred camp quesadillas he's made every trip since I've known him, and I let him have the satisfaction of thinking I hadn't noticed the burnt corners for seasons running. We spent that first evening going over permits with a resource management ranger. An unassigned cave system flag for survey work after a partial collapse had opened what looked like new passage, previously sealed off from the tube it connected to. It was exactly the kind of discovery that gets geologists like us genuinely excited. New ground nobody had walked or measured, at least not recently, at least not that anyone official knew about. The ranger, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Yvette Calloway who'd worked the monument for over a decade, walked us through the closure map. Most of it's standard stuff: bat hibernation closures, unstable ceiling sections, caves closed simply because nobody had surveyed them safely yet. But she paused a beat longer than necessary over one particular cluster near the newly opened passage, said there'd been intermittent reports over the years of people going into that section without permits, gear left behind, fire rings found deep enough underground that nobody could explain how somebody had carried firewood that far. She said it in the flat, professional tone of someone reciting a fact rather than telling a ghost story, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd tried to make it spooky on purpose. I've heard some version of that story in almost every cave system I've ever worked. Somebody swears they found evidence of another person deep underground where no permit had been issued, and it almost always turns out to be an earlier survey team's forgotten gear, or a local kid who snuck in on a dare and left before getting caught. Caves distort things anyway. Sound most of all. A settling rock 200 feet away can sound exactly like a footstep 4 feet behind you, and I've trained myself over years of field work not to trust my ear underground the way I trust it on the surface. I told Yvette we'd stick to the survey plan and report anything unusual, meant every word of it, and didn't think about her warning again until we were already 300 feet into the tube the next morning. We geared up at first light, helmets, headlamps, secondary light sources, rope for the one vertical drop the survey notes mentioned, and Jonas ran his usual pre-entry checklist out loud, half habit and half superstition, the same way I check my own harness 3 times before trusting it with my weight. The entrance to the newly opened passage sat behind a section of collapsed ceiling that rangers had cleared just enough to allow foot traffic, and the tube beyond it had that particular untouched quality you only find in passage nobody's walked recently. No boot scuffs polishing the floor, no chalk survey marks, just raw basalt and shapes the lava had frozen into on its way somewhere 80,000 years ago. We worked methodically for the first few hours, Jonas calling out compass bearings and distances while I sketched the passage in my field notebook, the kind of unglamorous, Careful labor that makes up 90% of actual cave science, no matter what documentaries make it look like. About 400 feet in, I noticed a draft, faint but distinct, moving air where the survey notes suggested this passage should dead end into solid rock. Drafts and lava tubes usually mean another opening somewhere, a connection to the surface, or to another system entirely. And Jonas got excited about it in the specific way cavers get excited about a mystery that might mean more cave to map. Neither of us thought, at that point, to wonder what else a draft that size might mean. The draft led us to a fork the survey notes hadn't documented at all, a narrower side passage angling downward that felt, from the first few feet, meaningfully older than the main tube, its walls worn smoother in a way that suggested either far more water erosion over time or far more foot traffic than any official record accounted for. We debated turning back to report the discrepancy before continuing, the responsible move, but the pull of unmapped passage is its own kind of gravity for people in our field, and we told ourselves 20 more minutes of exploration wouldn't hurt anything. 20 minutes in, the passage narrowed enough that we had to remove our packs and push them ahead of us. And I remember feeling, for the first time that day, genuinely small in a way that had nothing to do with the tunnel's dimensions. About 60 feet past the squeeze, the passage opened back up into a chamber tall enough to stand in, and Jonas's headlamp caught something wedged into a natural shelf of rock along the far wall before either of us had said a word about it. A hand axe sold, the handle wrapped in cord gone brittle and dark, positioned deliberately rather than dropped or lost. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds, both running through the same short list of explanations, none of which accounted comfortably for a tool like that sitting untouched, apparently placed with intention, in a passage the monument's own records insisted had never been surveyed, let alone visited, by anyone in living memory. We photographed the axe from every angle before touching it, the same protocol we'd use for any unexpected artifact, and Jonas turned it over carefully once he'd gotten a full set of images, noting aloud that the cordage looked hand-twisted rather than manufactured, the metal head shaped in a way that could have been decades old or could have been made last year by somebody skilled with a forge and a taste for old methods. We debated, briefly, whether to turn back immediately and report it to a vet, given that unpermitted artifacts sometimes meant unpermitted people, and people in remote cave systems sometimes meant exactly the kind of situation neither of us was equipped to handle. We decided, the way we always decide, that a little more documentation wouldn't hurt, and pushed further into the chamber to see what else it might be holding. Past the axe, the chamber's far wall held a cluster of scratches too regular to be natural weathering, grouped in sets of 5 the way people mark time when they've lost access to a calendar, dozens of groups running down the rock in a column that must have taken months, if not years, to accumulate. Near the base of the wall sat a small ring of stones holding cold ash, definitely a fire, definitely recent enough that the char still smelled faintly of smoke rather than having weathered into nothing, which raised the obvious, uncomfortable question of ventilation. Open flame that deep underground meant either an unusually large draft system or somebody willing to risk carbon monoxide buildup for reasons that mattered more to them than the risk did. Jonas pulled out the gas meter we carry as standard safety gear on any unfamiliar system, more out of habit than real worry, and the readings came back stranger than either of us expected. Oxygen slightly depleted, carbon dioxide elevated above surface levels, but not yet at anything the meter flagged as dangerous. The kind of numbers you'd expect in a poorly ventilated space that saw regular fire use without much airflow to clear it. He noted it in his log, said we should keep an eye on it and not linger longer than necessary. The practical caution of someone who's seen what bad air does to people's judgment before they even notice anything's wrong. I remember filing that warning away and, in hindsight, not respecting it nearly as much as I should have over the next hour. We kept working, cataloging the tally marks, sketching the chamber's dimensions, and somewhere in the middle of that careful, tedious labor, I heard something that didn't fit the acoustic profile of settling rock or dripping water, a low sound with almost a rhythm to it, gone before I could get Jonas's attention to confirm he'd heard it too. When I described it to him, he offered the entirely reasonable explanation that lava tubes distort sound in ways that make single, ordinary noises seem patterned or directional when they aren't, an explanation I'd given other people myself more than once. I wanted to believe him. Some part of me, professionally trained to distrust exactly this kind of unverified sensory report, mostly did believe him. But a smaller, less reasonable part of me kept one ear angled toward the passage behind us for the rest of that hour. By the time we checked our watches again, we'd spent nearly 2 hours past our planned turnaround point, an uncharacteristic lapse for two people who track survey time obsessively as a basic safety habit, and neither of us had a great explanation for how it had slipped past us so completely. We packed up to head back toward the main tube, retracing what should have been a straightforward 20-minute route back through the squeeze. Except the squeeze took considerably longer to find than it should have, both of us second-guessing turns that had felt obvious on the way in, and now looked identical to 2 or 3 other unremarkable stretches of passage. Jonas blamed the gas meter's numbers, said mild hypoxia does exactly this to spatial memory, and I wanted that explanation to be the whole story badly enough that I didn't push back on it. We found the squeeze eventually, pushed back through it with the particular relief that comes from trading a tight space for a slightly less tight one, and made it back to where we'd left our packs at the fork, gear stage for the return trip along the main tube. Except the packs weren't quite how we'd left them. Jonas's spare battery pack sat a foot from where he distinctly remembered setting it, and my field notebook, which I tucked closed inside a dry bag, sat open on top of my pack with a page folded down in a way I hadn't done myself. Neither of us said the obvious thing out loud right away, that somebody or something had been through our gear while we were in the chamber, but I watched Jonas do the same silent inventory I was doing, and neither of us liked the math. We didn't discuss it beyond a few clipped, practical sentences about getting out efficiently, packed up faster than our usual careful protocol allowed, and started back along the main tube at a pace considerably quicker than the leisurely survey speed we kept on the way in. The tube felt different moving fast than it had moving slow, familiar landmarks blurring past instead of getting properly documented, our headlamps throwing shifting shadows across basalt formations that looked, at that speed, a lot more like shapes crouched in the dark than geology deserved credit for. Neither of us said we were scared. We just kept moving, faster than strictly necessary for two experienced cavers who'd walked this exact stretch of tube only a few hours earlier without incident. About 200 feet from the entrance collapse, with actual daylight visible as a gray smudge ahead of us for the first time in hours, I heard that same low, patterned sound again, close enough this time that even Jonas stopped moving to listen, his usual reasonable explanations visibly failing to assemble themselves fast enough to say out loud. It came from somewhere behind us, in the direction of the fork we just left, evenly spaced, deliberate in a way that no dripping water or settling basalt has ever managed to sound to either of us in years of fieldwork combined. Jonas looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched him decide not to offer an explanation at all, just nodded toward the daylight ahead and picked up his pace without another word. We came out of that collapse into full daylight faster than either of us has ever exited a survey site, blinking against sun that felt almost aggressive after hours of headlamp-only vision, and didn't stop moving until we'd put real distance between ourselves and the entrance. Jonas said, once we caught our breath, that we needed to report all of it to Yvette immediately. The axe, the tally marks, the disturbed gear, the sound. No more deciding for ourselves what counted as worth mentioning. I agreed completely, meant it as much as I've ever meant anything in the field, and we started the walk back toward the visitor center already rehearsing, without saying so out loud, how we were going to explain all of this to somebody who was going to want a much more coherent story than either of us currently had. Yvette's reaction to our report wasn't the calm, procedural response I'd expected from someone who'd warned us so evenly the day before. She went quiet for a beat too long after we described the tally marks and the disturbed gear, then admitted, more directly than her earlier warning had, that we weren't the first survey team to come back with a story like this, just the first in a couple of years, and that previous reports had never been substantiated enough to justify a full search operation. She said she needed to close that section formally and get a law enforcement ranger involved before anyone went back in, standard protocol given what we described, which meant our remaining survey equipment, 2 expensive gas meters and a rope rig, would sit in that chamber indefinitely unless somebody retrieved it first. Jonas floated the idea of one quick trip back in, just to the fork, just to grab the gear, nothing past that point, framed carefully enough that even I could hear him making the same kind of bargain with himself that had gotten us into that chamber in the first place. Yvette pushed back, hard, said she didn't love it, but eventually agreed to a narrow window that afternoon if we stuck strictly to the main tube and didn't go anywhere near the fork side passage. Handed us a monument radio with strict instructions to check in every 20 minutes without fail. I told myself this was a reasonable, bounded risk, distinct from the open-ended exploring we'd done that morning, and mostly believed it, the same way I'd mostly believed Jonas's explanation for that first strange sound the day before. We made good time back to the fork, checking in with Yvette on schedule, the main tube feeling almost embarrassingly ordinary in full daylight-adjusted eyes compared to how threatening it had felt fleeing the day before. When we reached the spot where we'd left the rope rig and gas meters, though, neither was where we remembered leaving them. Not moved a few inches this time, but gone entirely, no trace of either item anywhere in the immediate area, which meant somebody had carried several pounds of equipment out of a supposedly closed section sometime in the roughly 18 hours since we'd fled it. Jonas keyed the radio to report the missing gear to Yvette, kept his voice level in a way that told me he was working hard to keep it that way. Jonas wanted to leave immediately, radio the finding to Yvette, and let whoever handled this professionally take it from there, and under any other circumstances, I'd have agreed with him without hesitation. But something at the mouth of the side passage caught my eye while he was still on the radio, a fresh scrape in the dust, wide and dragged rather than stepped, exactly the width you'd expect from somebody hauling a rope bag along the ground rather than carrying it. I told Jonas, and watched him more visibly with the promise we'd made Yvette against the very reasonable argument that whoever took our gear might still be close enough to identify if we moved fast and careful. We compromised on 10 feet past the fork line, just far enough to look. Neither of us fully believed we'd actually stop at 10 feet. The drag marks led further than 10 feet almost immediately, curving away from the main side passage into a narrow offshoot neither of our survey notes had documented even as an unmapped lead, and about 30 feet and we found a single leatherwork glove, torn across the palm, dropped rather than set down deliberately, next to a scuff mark in the dust that looked distinctly like the heel of a boot dug in hard against something pulling the other direction. Neither of us said the word we were both thinking, but I watched Jonas's expression do the same thing mine must have been doing, running quickly through every explanation that didn't involve another person being dragged somewhere against their will and coming up short on anything that actually fit what we were looking at. Jonas tried the radio and got nothing back but static, which he attributed, reasonably, to the extra rock now between us and the surface repeater, though the timing did nothing to help either of our nerves. He said, firmly this time, that we were done pushing our luck, that finding evidence of another person in trouble meant getting professional rescue resources moving immediately rather than improvising further ourselves. And I agreed with every word of it right up until I heard, faint but unmistakably human, a voice calling out from somewhere ahead of us in the dark, weak, cracked, clearly, in distress. Jonas heard it too. Neither of us discussed turning back again after that. We called out as we moved, careful not to rush the terrain, even with adrenaline screaming at us to, and got an answer back each time, thinner and less coherent than the last, enough to follow, but not enough to reassure either of us that whoever it belonged had much time left in them. The passage narrowed twice more before it opened into a low chamber, and my headlamp caught a shape against the far wall that resolved, as I got closer, into a woman roughly my own age, wrists bound with the same rope from our missing rig, one ankle bent at an angle that made my stomach drop even before I registered anything else about her condition. She flinched hard when my light hit her, then sagged with something like relief once she registered we weren't who she'd been afraid we were. And the first coherent thing she managed to say, through a voice gone ragged from disuse, was that he was still down here, that he came back on some kind of schedule, and we needed to move before he did. Jonas got to work on the rope at her wrists immediately while I turned to watch the passage we'd come through, headlamp off, listening harder than I've ever listened to anything in my life, trying to separate ordinary cave sound from anything that might actually be footsteps closing the distance behind us. I heard him before Jonas finished the last knot, that same low, evenly paced sound from the day before, except close now, close enough that I could tell it wasn't an echo or a trick of the tube's acoustics at all. It was moving with purpose, unhurried the way Jonas's calm explanations had never quite managed to convince either of us it should be, coming from the exact direction we need to go to get this woman out of that chamber and back toward daylight. I looked at Jonas, at the woman barely able to stand between us, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost calm compared to the fear underneath it, that whatever decision we made in the next 30 seconds was going to matter more than any decision I'd made in my entire life up to that point. I remember the draft. Whatever this offshoot connected to, air was moving through it toward some opening we hadn't found yet. And moving air in a lava tube almost always means a way out, even if it's not the way we came in. I told Jonas we needed to go deeper into the unmapped section instead of back the way that sound was coming from, which felt, saying it out loud, like the worst possible idea a rational person could have. Right up until I reminded both of us that rational was exactly what had kept us safe compared to whoever this woman had been down here with for however long. Jonas didn't argue. He got an arm on our good side, and we started moving in a passage neither of us had any real data on beyond a hunch about airflow. Raina, she told us her name was Raina Okafor between labored breaths, said she'd been backpacking the monument's backcountry trails alone almost 3 weeks ago when she'd taken what she thought was a shortcut through a lava tube entrance and never made it back out the other side. She didn't have much more to offer about the man beyond fragments, that he didn't talk much, that he seemed to know every inch of tunnel down here better than any ranger or scientist ever could, that he moved without a light most of the time, navigating by memory or something else entirely, which was somehow the detail that unsettled me most out of everything she'd said so far. The sound behind us shifted direction twice in ways that made no sense if he was simply following our exact path, cutting instead through what must have been connecting passage he knew and we didn't, gaining ground on us in a way that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with familiarity with terrain we were seeing for the very first time. We hit a squeeze that Raina, weakened as she was, could barely fit through, and Jonas went first to pull her from the other side while I pushed from behind. Every second we spent maneuvering her through that gap feeling like a second handed directly to whoever was closing on us through passage he'd clearly walked 1,000 times before. On the other side of the squeeze, gray light filtered down through a small skylight collapse maybe 30 feet ahead. The most beautiful thing I think I've ever seen underground in 4 years of field work. And we were maybe 10 feet from it when he came through a side opening directly into our path, closer and faster than either of us had braced for. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40s, lean in a way that spoke to a diet of whatever this landscape could provide rather than any kind of intentional fitness, dressed in layers gone the same uniform gray-black as the basalt around him. And he didn't say anything at all, just planted himself squarely between us and that column of daylight like a man defending ground he'd defended before. I did the only thing I could think of in that half second, which was aim my headlamp directly at his face and click it to full strobe setting, a feature I'd genuinely never used for anything but signaling before that moment, and watch him recoil hard enough to stumble backward, hands coming up against light that clearly hurt him in a way it wouldn't hurt someone who spent regular time adjusting between dark and day. Whatever else was true about him, he'd been down here long enough, consistently enough, that his eyes had adapted to darkness in a way mine never fully would, and for the 2 or 3 seconds that strobe bought us, that adaptation became a genuine weakness instead of the advantage it had clearly been the rest of the encounter. Jonas shoved past him first, hauling Raina with him, and the man's hand shot out and caught Jonas's jacket hard enough to spin him half around before Jonas drove an elbow back that connected with something solid enough to make the man grunt and lose his grip. I got a shoulder into the gap Jonas had made and pulled Raina the rest of the way through by her uninjured arm, feeling something wrench in my own shoulder in the process that I knew, even in the moment, was going to hurt considerably worse once the adrenaline wore off. Behind us, I heard him recovering, footsteps scrabbling against basalt. Not gone, not defeated, just delayed by however many seconds that strobe and Jonas's elbow had bought us. The skylight collapse gave us a rough, unstable climb rather than any kind of easy exit, loose rubble shifting under our boots as we scrambled upward with Raina between us, Jonas boosting her for below while I reached down from a ledge partway up to haul her the rest of the way by her good arm. I could hear him below us now, closer than I wanted to think about, navigating that same unstable rubble with a confidence that came from having done this climb, or one like it, more times than I wanted to imagine, and I didn't look down to confirm how close, just kept pulling and boosting and climbing with every bit of strength adrenaline had left in my body to give. We came up out of that skylight in a full daylight and open scrubland, all three of us collapsing more than climbing over the final lip of broken rock, and I got my radio working again the second we cleared enough rubble to get signal, screaming coordinates and a description at Yvette faster than I'm sure made any sense on her end. Whether he followed us up through that same opening, I genuinely don't know. By the time I caught my breath enough to look back toward the collapse, there was no sign of him at the surface at all, no shape climbing out behind us, nothing but the dark mouth of the skylight leading back down into a system he clearly knew far better than any map anyone had ever made of it. A Ranger truck reached us within 20 minutes, impossibly fast, and still not fast enough for how long that stretch of scrubland had felt while we waited, and paramedics had Raina stabilized and moving toward an ambulance before I'd even fully processed that we were actually physically safe. Jonas sat beside me on the tailgate of Yvette's truck, one hand pressed to a rib. He was pretty sure the man had cracked in that scuffle. Both of us staring back at that dark scrubland were somewhere below our boots. In tunnels neither of us had any real desire to see mapped. Someone who'd navigated 80,000-year-old lava tube systems better than any scientist we knew was still, as far as either of us could tell, down there. Raina went to the hospital in Klamath Falls with a fractured ankle, dehydration severe enough to need real medical attention, and injuries that told a story the doctors didn't need us to explain twice. Jonas got his cracked rib wrapped and spent a night under observation, more as a precaution than a necessity. I gave the first of what would turn into several long statements to a county sheriff's investigator that same afternoon, walking through the axe, the tally marks, the disturbed gear, the drag marks, Raina's account, and the man himself, in as much careful professional detail as I could manage with my hands still not fully steady. The monument authorized a full search operation within a day. Rangers and sheriff's deputies, and a specialized cave rescue team out of Oregon coordinating an effort that, even with everyone's best resources, ran up hard against the same basic problem Jonas and I had encountered from the very beginning. Lava beds holds more than 800 surveyed caves and an unknown number of unsurveyed ones, connected in places nobody's ever fully mapped, through passage that can run for miles under. Scrubland that gives absolutely nothing away on the surface. Searching that kind of system for one person who clearly knew it better than anyone else alive was never going to be a fast or simple undertaking, and everyone involved understood that going in. What the search team found over the following week matched grimly against a handful of other disappearances the county had on file going back nearly a decade. Hikers and backcountry campers who'd vanished from the monument's more remote trail systems. Cases that had gone cold for lack of any physical evidence pointing anywhere specific. They never found the man himself. Not in that first search, not in the extended one that followed with additional resources brought in from 2 counties over. Record searches turned up one plausible match. A local man reported missing by his own family more than 12 years earlier, after walking into the lava beds alone and never coming back out, though nobody could confirm that identification with anything more solid than Raina's exhausted, traumatized description. The Park Service formally gated the collapse entrance within a month, installed monitoring equipment at what access points they could identify, and reclassified the entire unmapped system as an active investigation site rather than a research opportunity, which meant Jonas's and my own academic project effectively ended there. Whatever data we'd already collected suddenly feeling a lot less significant than it had a few weeks earlier. I don't know if anyone's gone back into that system since, officially or otherwise. I know I haven't, and I don't expect I ever will again. Not for any amount of unmapped basalt passage or unpublished dissertation material. My dissertation committee, when I finally explained why an entire plan chapter of fieldwork had simply stopped, was more understanding than I expected. Though I still haven't fully decided how to write around a discovery I can't ethically publish detailed coordinates for. Jonas and I don't talk about that day directly much, but something shifted between us that I don't have a clean word for. Not romance exactly. More like the specific kind of closeness that comes from 2 people trusting each other with something that mattered more than either of our careers in the moment it counted. We still work together. We haven't gone back to lava beds since, and neither of us has suggested it. Raina's recovering, physically at least, back with family in Bend, and we've stayed loosely in touch since, though her account of those 3 weeks has never fully cohered into anything linear. She remembers fragments, sounds, a handful of conversations that may or may not have actually happened the way she remembers them. The ordinary aftermath of trauma, layered over 3 weeks in a place with no natural light to mark the passage of days. The one thing she said consistently every time we've spoken is that she doesn't think he ever left that system, that whatever else is true about him, that maze of lava tube is the only place he actually knows how to survive anymore. And some part of me believes her completely. I think sometimes about that interpretive sign at Captain Jack's stronghold, about a landscape that hid an entire group of people from an army for months on nothing but knowledge of terrain and a willingness to use it. And I can't fully separate that history anymore from the man who used the exact same landscape 150 years later, for reasons I'll probably never understand and don't especially want to. Lava beds has always been a place built for hiding, geologically and historically both, long before any of us showed up with headlamps and gas meters and a research grant. And I think that's part of what unsettles me most in hindsight. We weren't discovering something the landscape had never seen before. We were just the latest people to walk into a use it had always been suited for. We never got the gas meters or the rope rig back, written off eventually as a research loss on a grant report that undersells, by a considerable margin, what actually happened to them. I've noticed some small changes in myself since. Nothing dramatic, just a new habit of checking my headlamp's battery level obsessively, even on short survey trips, and a tightness in my chest during squeezes that never used to bother me. The kind of thing I recognize clinically as a reasonable response to genuine danger, and still can't quite talk myself out of feeling anyway. Some nights, working late on data from other, safer cave systems, I catch myself listening for a particular low, evenly paced sound underneath the ordinary hum of my apartment. The kind of sound a lava tube makes when something moves through it with total confidence about exactly where it's going. And I have to remind myself, every time, that I'm sitting in a second-floor apartment in Davis with no lava tube anywhere underneath me. I believe that mostly, but I still haven't published the coordinates of that chamber, and some part of me hopes nobody ever finds a reason to ask me for them. My name is Ren Castellano. I'm 34, and until 2 years ago, I sold real estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Now home is 4 wheels and whatever's outside the window. My boyfriend Desmond Okafor, 36, quit his job as an electrician the same month I quit mine, and together we put about 60,000 miles behind us. My best friend since college, Priya Anand, 29, flew in from Chicago to ride with us for 2 weeks. She'd never camped a day in her life, which Des found endlessly funny. We were headed for the Red River Gorge, that stretch of Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky known for its sandstone arches and cliffside climbing routes. I'd read about a dispersed camping pull-off along Tunnel Ridge Road. No fee, no rangers checking in on you, just gravel and trees, and a view that supposedly made grown men cry. Priya kept asking if there'd be bears. Des kept telling her there'd be worse things than bears, then laughing before she could get mad at him. We pulled in around 4 in the afternoon, the light already turning that syrupy gold color it gets in October. The pull-off was empty except for us, tucked against a wall of rock with the forest dropping away on the other side. Priya stood at the edge for a long minute, just looking. "It's like nobody's ever been here," she said. Des told her people had been coming through these hills for 200 years, moonshiners and hermits and hikers, and every single one of them probably said the exact same thing. I want to tell you the first sign wasn't a sound or a shadow, because that's not how it actually happened. The first sign was a smell. Wood smoke, faint, coming from somewhere downhill where there was no other campsite marked on any map I'd looked at. Des shrugged it off. Could have been drifting from a farm. Could have been anything. I made a joke about somebody's illegal still and let it go, because that's what you do when you've been on the road long enough. You stop assuming every little thing means something. We set up chairs, cracked open beers, and Priya insisted on cooking dinner over the fire, even though she burned the first batch of foil-wrapped potatoes to charcoal. We laughed about it, so hard my stomach hurt. That's the version of the night I want you to hold on to for a second, because it's real, and it's the last easy night any of us had for a while. Des played guitar badly. Priya sang worse. I remember thinking this was exactly the life I traded my desk job for. Around 9, headlights swept the trees below us, climbing the ridge road slow, too slow, like whoever was already knew we were up there and wasn't in any hurry. The vehicle never came into view. The lights just crept along under the tree line, then died out. Des said it was probably some local kid parking to smoke. Priya went quiet, which for Priya was its own kind of statement. I told myself the same thing Des had, that people have been coming through these hills 200 years, and we were nobody special to whoever that was. I didn't sleep well. Somewhere close to midnight, I heard footsteps on gravel, unhurried, circling once around us at a distance before stopping altogether. I lay there with my hand on Des's arm, not waking him, telling myself it was a deer, telling myself, deer, don't wear boots. In the morning I almost mentioned it and didn't, because in the daylight, with coffee going and Priya complaining about her back from sleeping wrong, it felt small. It felt like nothing. That was the first mistake, and I want to own it now the way I couldn't then. Not saying something. Not one of us said a single word about the smoke, the crawling headlights, the footsteps, because none of it added up to anything you could point at. We packed up a light day bag and set off down the Sheltawi Trace toward Chimney Top Rock, Priya practically skipping ahead of us. And for a few hours the whole ridge felt like ours again. It wasn't. It had never been. The trail to Chimney Top Rock cuts through a stand of hemlock, so thick the light goes green, and Priya kept stopping to take pictures, saying her Chicago friends would never believe a place like this was real. Des walked point, the way he always did, joking that if we ran into a bear he'd trip me first for a head start. I laughed because I always laughed at that joke, and because the morning had scrubbed most of the previous night's static right out of my head. About a mile in, we found a structure that wasn't on any map. Half a cabin, roof caving on one side, notched logs gone soft and black with rot. Des wanted to poke around inside. I told him no, mostly out of some half-formed respect for whoever used to live there. But he went in anyway, and came back out holding a rusted tin sign, edges eaten through, the kind that used to advertise chewing tobacco or feed stores. Somebody's granddad's place, he said, tossing it back through the doorway. None of us thought much more of it. Priya found the second thing, tucked under a slab of fallen roof. A mason jar, lid rusted shut, and inside it, yellowed newspaper folded into quarters. Des pried the lid loose with his multi-tool. The clipping was local, dated 1987, a short piece about a hiker gone missing off this same stretch of trail. Never found. Search called off after 3 weeks. Priya read it out loud in a voice that tried to be funny and wasn't quite. Well, Des said, guess we know not to wander off. I remember thinking it was a strange thing for somebody to seal up and hide, like a keepsake or a warning. We kept the clipping, which in hindsight feels like the second mistake, though I couldn't tell you what taking it or leaving it would have changed. Chimney Top Rock itself was worth the whole hike, a narrow spine of stone with the gorge falling away 300 feet on either side, ridgelines stacked blue into the distance. Priya sat right at the edge with her legs hanging off, which made my palms sweat just watching her. Des took her picture. For 20 minutes, nothing existed except 3 friends and a view too big to fit in your chest. On the way back down, Priya swore she saw someone standing off-trail, maybe 40 yards out between 2 trunks, not moving. By the time Des and I turned to look, there was nothing there but trees doing what trees do in wind, shifting, resettling. She was rattled enough that she didn't say much the rest of the walk. I told her it happens out here. Your eyes fill in gaps that aren't really there. I believed it when I said it. I want to be honest that I believed it. Back at the van, everything looked exactly the way we'd left it, which should have been reassuring and instead felt like the opposite because I found myself counting the chairs, checking the cooler latch. Priya noticed me doing it and asked if something was wrong, and I said no, just making sure the raccoons hadn't gotten in. Des built the fire again, same as the night before, and for a while the ordinary rhythm of camp chores talked me down off whatever ledge my head had wandered onto. Full dark came on fast under the tree cover. Around 8, Priya went to grab something from the van and came back holding a granola bar wrapper, saying she was sure she hadn't left trash on the ground by the tire. Des said maybe it blew there. I picked it up and turned it over. Not our brand. None of us bought that brand. I didn't say that part out loud. I just folded it into my pocket like it was evidence of something, though I couldn't have told you of what. That night the wood smoke came back, stronger, close enough that Priya asked if we should be worried about a wildfire. Des walked to the edge of the pull-off and stood there a long time, looking down into black trees, before coming back and saying it was probably a controlled Forest Service burn, nothing to lose sleep over. I noticed he didn't sit back down right away. I noticed he kept his eyes on the tree line, even while he was talking to us about something else entirely. And that told me more than anything he actually said. By the time we turned in, none of us were joking anymore, not the way we had been the night before. Priya asked, quiet, if we could maybe just leave in the morning, find someplace a little more campground-y, her word for someplace with other people in it. I said sure, of course, thinking it was a reasonable thing to want. I didn't know yet that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as just deciding to go. I didn't know that whoever had been circling us the night before had already made up their mind about what happened next. I woke up to Des cursing under his breath at 6 in the morning, crouched by the front tire with his hand flat against the sidewall. Someone had let the air out, not slashed, not punctured, just opened the valve stem and let it bleed out slow overnight, which meant somebody had crouched right there in the dark next to us and taken their time doing it. Priya came out in her sleep shirt, saw Des's face, and didn't ask questions. She just stood there hugging herself while he hooked up the compressor. We found a second valve stem loosened on the rear tire while the first one was still filling. That's when the morning stopped being about tires. Des straightened up slow, looked at me, and said the words I've been waiting for since the footsteps 2 nights back. Somebody wants us to know they were here. Not wants us gone. Wants us to know. There's a difference. And standing in that gravel lot with birds going about their business overhead like nothing was wrong, I understood exactly which one we were dealing with. Priya wanted to call the sheriff's office right then. I dialed and got 1 bar of signal that dropped the call twice before connecting. The dispatcher took our location, said a deputy would swing by when one was free, gave no promise on timing. Des finished airing up both tires while we waited, checking every hose and cable underneath with a flashlight, and found nothing else tampered with, which somehow felt worse than finding more damage would have. Whoever did this hadn't wanted to strand us. They'd wanted our full attention. The deputy who eventually showed, a heavy-set man named Purcell who'd clearly worked this stretch of the gorge a long time, listened to the whole thing with his hat pushed back, then told us something that settled cold in my stomach. There'd been a string of incidents over the years around dispersed sites off Tunnel Ridge, gear gone missing, tents found slashed. One report a few seasons back of a solo hiker who wouldn't say what happened to him, just packed out and never came back to the gorge again. Nobody caught, nobody charged. He recommended we move sites before dark. He didn't recommend we stay in the area at all, though he stopped short of saying so outright. We took his advice halfway, packed up, drove 20 minutes to a developed campground near Slade with a check-in booth and other rigs parked close enough to wave at. Priya visibly exhaled for the first time in 2 days. Des backed us into a site between a retired couple from Ohio and a family with 2 kids on bikes. And for the rest of the afternoon, it felt like we'd stepped back into a normal vacation, the kind with quarters for the shower house and somebody's radio playing classic rock 2 sites over. It was Priya who spotted the granola wrapper brand again, this time crushed flat under our own picnic table 20 minutes after we'd set up in a campground we'd chosen at random that same afternoon. I remember the exact second none of us said anything, because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way we weren't ready for. Des picked it up without a word, walked to the trash can by the bathhouse, and dropped it in like that alone could end things. I watched him do it, and thought about how a person would have to already be behind us on the road to have that here before we did. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay listening to the family 2 sites over laughing over a card game, the Ohio couple's dog barking once at nothing. All these ordinary camp sounds that should have been comforting and instead felt like a thin blanket over something underneath. Around 1 in the morning, Des's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For words, nothing threatening on its face. You left something behind. He showed it to me without a word. Priya, awake in the back, asked what was wrong, and neither of us answered her right away. We debated calling Purcell back and decided against it. What would we even report? A text message with no name attached. Words that could mean nothing at all. Des wanted to leave the state entirely by morning, cut our losses, put 300 miles behind us before lunch. I agreed before he'd even finished the sentence. Priya said she'd never wanted to hear the word Kentucky again in her life, and under different circumstances it would have been funny. We took turns keeping watch in 2-hour shifts until sunrise, and somewhere around 4 I caught movement at the tree line beyond the bathhouse, gone before I could be sure I'd seen it all. By morning we had a plan. Hit the road by 7, put Lexington behind us by breakfast, be in Ohio before lunch. Des went to settle up at the check-in booth while Priya and I broke down camp. That's when I noticed our spare tire was gone from its cradle under the frame. Not damaged, not slashed, simply gone, taking some time in the 2-hour gap between my watch and Des's. Whoever this was hadn't just followed us to a new campground 20 minutes away in the dark. They'd walked right up to us again, and this time they'd taken something instead of just leaving something behind. Des wanted to drive on the flat rather than waste another hour waiting on road service that might not come for half a day out here. I talked him out of it. A blown tire on a mountain road at speed felt like a worse bet than losing the morning. We called a tow contact the campground host recommended, a man named Garrett who ran a one-bay garage 15 minutes off the highway, and he said he could get to us by 9. 9 came and went. He finally rolled up at 11, apologetic, saying his phone had been dead all morning. No explanation for why that had taken 2 hours to notice. Garrett hooked us up and towed us to a shop, a low cinder block building at the edge of a hollow with 2 dogs chained near the office door and a scatter of dead vehicles rusting in the weeds behind it. He said he'd need to order the tire size we ran, wouldn't have it till the next afternoon at the earliest. Priya's face went through about 4 stages of upset before settling on something quiet and scared. Des asked if there was anywhere safe to park overnight nearby. Garrett said his own lot was fine, free of charge. Nobody would bother us there. I didn't like the shop from the first minute, though I couldn't have told you why beyond a general sense that Garrett watched us a beat too long whenever he thought we weren't looking. Des chalked it up to small-town unfamiliarity with outsiders. I wanted to believe him. We spent the afternoon walking the half-mile into the nearest town for food, and it was there, at a gas station register, that the clerk asked where we were staying and went quiet himself when Des mentioned Garrett's name, quiet in a way that wasn't nothing. Back at the shop that evening, parked under a single sodium light that hummed and flickered, Priya asked outright if we could just sleep in shifts again. Des agreed without argument, which told me he felt it too, whatever it was. Around 10 the dog started up, not barking at nothing the way dogs do, but a low continuous growl aimed at the tree line past the fence, ears flat, hackles raised, neither one willing to come closer to whatever held their attention. Garrett's office light had gone dark 2 hours earlier. We hadn't heard him lock up a drive off. I took first watch, sitting up front with the dome light off, and around 11:30 I saw him. Not a shadow, not an impression, a man standing at the tree line just past the fence, still as the trunks around him, watching the van without moving for what felt like 10 full minutes. I woke Des without a sound, just a hand on his chest, and pointed. By the time Des's eyes adjusted, the spot was empty. He believed me anyway. That was the moment I understood we weren't going to talk our way past this with reasonable explanations anymore. Priya woke to both of us tense and silent, and immediately understood the shape of it without needing details. She said we should just start driving now, flat tire or not. Better a slow crawl toward town than sitting still. Des was already moving toward the driver's seat when the first dog stopped growling all at once, mid-breath. The kind of silence that means something has gotten close enough that even the thing sounding the alarm has decided alarm isn't the priority anymore. The second dog didn't make a sound at all. The blow came against the driver's side window before Des had the key in the ignition. Not shattering it, just a flat, deliberate strike, a fist or the heel of a hand, hard enough to rock the van on its springs. Priya screamed. Des threw the van into gear on a flat tire, and we lurched forward at maybe 15 miles an hour, rim grinding against asphalt, sparks visible in the side mirror, putting distance between us and the shop before either dog made another sound. I didn't look back to see who'd hit the glass. I understood, somehow, that seeing his face wasn't a thing I actually wanted. We made it 4 miles on a destroyed tire before the rim gave out entirely, and the van dropped hard onto the wheel well, undrivable. Des pulled as far onto the shoulder as the ruined wheel allowed, cut the engine, and for a moment none of us said anything at all, just breathing in the dark with the hazards ticking. Then Priya, in a voice gone completely flat, said there were headlights behind us, stopped a 1/4 mile back on the empty road. Not approaching, just waiting, the same patient distance those first headlights had kept 2 nights before this had all started meaning anything. I called 911 with 1 bar of signal and got through this time. Gave our best guess at mile marker. Tried to keep my voice level while Priya cried quietly in the back seat and Des sat with a tire iron across his knees, watching the mirror. The headlights behind us didn't move for the entire 11 minutes it took a deputy to arrive, And the second his light bar came into view around the bend, they winked out, gone, no engine, sound of vehicle pulling away, nothing, just there, and then simply not there anymore, like something that had decided the game was over for the night, but not finished altogether. Deputy Purcell was the one who answered the call, which felt like a strange kind of relief given everything he'd already told us 2 days earlier. He listened to the whole account, the shop, the dogs, the fist against the glass, with his jaw set tighter each time. And when Des mentioned Garrett's name specifically, something shifted in Purcell's face that he tried to smooth over and didn't quite manage. He told us to sit tight in his cruiser while he radioed for backup, and made a call that used Garrett's full name and the words "known to us" in a tone that told me this wasn't the first complaint tied to that shop. Backup found the tree line search inconclusive that night. No one located. No vehicle found idling anywhere along the road we described. But at first light, a second deputy walking the fence line behind Garrett's lot found the man himself. Not hiding, not running, sitting on an overturned bucket near the dead vehicles out back like he'd simply been waiting for someone to come ask him something. He didn't resist. He also, according to what Purcell told us later that morning, didn't say much of anything that made sense. Fragments about keeping track of who came through, about people who didn't belong, delivered flat and almost bored. They searched the property with a warrant that afternoon. I wasn't there for it, and I'm grateful for that, because what they found in a root cellar behind the garage was enough to end Garrett's freedom for a very long time, without me ever needing the specifics beyond what made the local paper. Personal items belonging to at least 3 travelers reported missing from that stretch of highway over the better part of a decade, none of whom had ever been found. The 1987 clipping weed pulled out of that mason jar on the trail wasn't some old forgotten tragedy. It was the first entry in something that had never actually stopped. Priya didn't speak on the 4-hour drive to return the rental car we ended up needing, just stared out the window with her knees pulled to her chest the way she used to sit as a kid, according to what she told me once we were both steadier. Des drove the whole way with both hands locked at 10 and 2, checking the mirror at intervals long after there was any reason left to. I kept thinking about the granola wrapper under our picnic table, how casually we'd almost let ourselves believe it meant nothing, how many small warnings we'd talked each other out of over 3 days because the alternative was too large to hold. We gave statements for 2 more days before Kentucky would let us go. Purcell, to his credit, drove out personally to tell us in person rather than by phone that they'd matched physical evidence from the root cellar to at least one of the missing persons cases going back 6 years, and that charges would likely include more than trespassing and property damage by the time it was finished. He didn't sugarcoat what he thought would have happened to us if that flat tire hadn't forced us into town, hadn't put us somewhere with witnesses and cameras and a deputy 15 minutes out, instead of alone on a ridge with no signal at all. Priya flew home from Lexington 3 days early, and I don't blame her one bit. She hugged me at the gate longer than either of us was used to, and said something I've held on to since, that some places don't care how careful you are. They just wait for you to stop paying attention for one single night. Des and I sat in an airport parking lot afterward for a long time, without starting the engine, neither of us in any hurry to get back on a highway that ran anywhere near that county again. We did get back on the road eventually, because that's what you do, but we skipped 2 states entirely just to put more distance behind us than the map strictly required. I still think about that mason jar sometimes, the newspaper clipping folded into quarters like a keepsake, and wonder how many people had found it over the years and, like us, simply put it back and kept walking. I wonder how many hadn't made it far enough to ever find it all. What stays with me isn't even the fist against the glass or the headlights that vanished the second real help arrived. It's smaller than that. It's the granola wrapper under the picnic table at a campground we'd chosen completely at random. Proof that being followed and being watched aren't the same thing at all. The second one means somebody already knows exactly where you're going before you decided it yourself. I don't camp alone anymore. I'm not sure I ever will again. My name is Roland Ashworth. I'm 52 years old, 26 years a firefighter in Buffalo before my knees gave out on me, and I finally hung up the boots. My wife Margot, to anyone who knows her, is 49, spent half her life as a labor and delivery nurse at Sisters Hospital. We sold the house in Cheektowaga 8 months ago, bought a used camper van off a guy in Depew, and decided we'd earned the right to see something other than a cul-de-sac for the rest of our years. Neither one of us had camped a night in our lives before this. Margot used to joke that the closest I'd come to the outdoors was mowing the lawn. We'd been reading about Zoar Valley for weeks, this gorge system down near Gowanda that locals call the Grand Canyon of New York. In the same breath, they warn you off it. No official campground, no ranger station there, just a scatter of pull-offs along South Forks Road, where people park to hike down into the valley. Margot found a spot online, a wide gravel clearing above the rim with a view down into hemlock and shale cliffs 300 feet deep. I liked that nobody would be checking permits. Margot liked the quiet. We didn't know yet that the quiet out there isn't the same thing as being alone. We got in around 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in early October. The leaves just starting to turn, the whole valley lit up gold and rust below us. An older man in a pickup was leaving as we arrived, and he slowed his window down long enough to say, "You two picked a good week for it, currents low." Margot asked him what he meant by that, and he just said the creek runs high most of the year, dangerous water, and this was about as safe as it got. He didn't smile when he said it. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to lead with, but I let it go the way you let a lot of things go on the road. We set up camp fast. I gotten decent at it after 8 months, could have the awning out and the chairs down in under 10 minutes. Margot made a pot of coffee on the little propane stove, and we sat there most of the afternoon, just looking down into the gorge, watching a hawk work the thermals along the far wall. It was, without exaggeration, one of the finest afternoons of my whole retirement. I told Margot that. She said, "Don't jinx it, Roland," in that tone she uses when she's only half kidding. Around 6, a strange sound rolled up out of the gorge, low and long. Not quite an animal, and not quite a person. Gone before either of us could agree on what we'd actually heard. Margot said fish or cat. They scream like a woman sometimes. She'd read that somewhere. I said probably. We'd both grown up around enough western New York woods to know the list of things that make noises you don't expect. Foxes, fishers, screech owls, and I ran through that list out loud like reciting it would settle the matter, which for about 20 minutes, it did. We hiked a short piece of the rim trail before dark, just to stretch our legs, and passed a hand-painted sign nailed to a tree that read, "Turn back, unstable ground," in letters gone gray with weather. Margot took a picture of it, said it'd make a good addition to the scrapbook she keeps of everywhere we've stopped. Neither of us thought much of it beyond that. Signs like that are all over gorge country, put up by whichever county owns the liability. We turned back well before the trail narrowed, made it to camp with just enough light left to start the fire. Dinner was simple. Foil packets of potatoes and sausage, a couple of beers, Margot telling me for the 3rd time that week how she still couldn't believe we'd actually done this, sold the house, put ourselves out here with nothing between us, and whatever weather rolled through except a steel roof. I told her that was the whole point. She laughed and said I sounded like a bumper sticker. It was good, that laugh. I want to hold on to it a little longer before I tell you what came next, because that was the last easy night we had out there, and neither one of us had any idea of it yet. Full dark settled and heavy under the tree cover. No other lights visible in any direction, which Margot said she found peaceful and I found, if I'm honest, a little more unsettling than I let on. Somewhere close to 11 a light appeared far down in the gorge, small and steady, moving along what would have to be the creek bed itself. Nobody hikes a flash flood gorge at night for fun. I pointed it out to Margot. She watched it for a while, said maybe it was a poacher. They get deer illegally out here sometimes. Everybody knows that. I wanted to believe her. The light moved with a kind of purpose that didn't feel like anybody hunting. I didn't sleep well, kept waking to check the window, and somewhere before dawn I heard, very clearly this time, footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate, circling the van once before going quiet. I lay there with my hand on the tire iron I kept under the bed, telling myself raccoons don't walk in that rhythm. Telling myself I was an old fireman spooked by his own imagination. In the morning, with coffee going and Margot humming to herself over the stove, I almost brought it up and didn't because it felt small in the daylight. It felt, the way these things always do at first, like nothing worth mentioning at all. We hiked down into the gorge itself the next morning, following a used trail that switched back steep through hemlock roots slick with dew. Margot went first, saying her knees were younger than mine, even if her hospital shifts had aged the rest of her plenty. About halfway down, we passed a rusted length of chain bolted into the shale wall, old climbing gear maybe, or something else entirely, and Margot ran her thumb along it, and said somebody put real work into getting up and down here once. Neither of us thought to wonder why. The creek bed at the bottom ran low and clear over flat shale, exactly like the man in the pickup had told us. And for an hour or so, it was everything we'd driven 3 hours for. Cliff walls rising vertical on both sides, waterfalls threading down through moss. That particular silence you only get at the bottom of a gorge where the wind can't reach. Margot waded out onto a flat rock and just stood there with her arms out like she was trying to hold the whole morning in place. I took a picture. I still have it. She looks happier in it than I think I'd ever seen her. We found the first strange thing about a mile downstream. A fire ring built into a hollow under an overhang. Ash gone cold but not old. And next to a stack of split firewood arranged with more care than any casual camper bothers with. Margot said maybe fishermen used it. I noticed, though I didn't say so out loud, that the firewood was split awful clean for somebody just passing through, and that whoever built that fire ring had chosen a spot completely invisible from the rim trail above, tucked back where the shale curved in on itself like a room. Further down, we came across a second thing that stopped us both cold for a second. A child's shoe, small, pink, half buried and silled at the creek's edge, sun-bleached like it had been there through more than one season. Margot picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and got quiet in a way I hadn't seen from her since her worst nights at the hospital. I told her creeks carry things for miles during high water, could have washed down from anywhere, could mean nothing at all about anybody being out here. She set it back down exactly where she'd found it, like putting it back mattered. We turned around not long after that, both of us a little subdued, the day's shine worn thin around the edges. On the climb back up, Margot asked if I'd heard something behind us on the trail, and I said it was probably just our own boots echoing off the rock, the way sound does funny in a gorge like this. She didn't argue the point, but she also didn't stop glancing back over her shoulder every few minutes. And by the time we hit the rim, I noticed I'd started doing the same thing without deciding to. Back at camp, everything sat exactly as we'd left it, which should have felt reassuring, and instead had me doing something I've never done before in my life. Counting our gear. Chairs, cooler, propane tank, all present, and I still walked the perimeter of the clearing twice like I was checking a fire scene for structural damage. Margot caught me at it and asked what was wrong. I told her nothing, just old habits, and she let it go, though I could tell she didn't fully believe me any more than I believed myself. That evening a truck came slow up the gravel road below our clearing, engine idling rough, headlights sweeping the trees, but never quite reaching us directly. It sat there a long while, maybe 10 minutes, before backing out the way it came. Margot asked if I thought it was the same man from yesterday, checking in on us friendly-like. I said probably, though something about the way those headlights had lingered without ever committing to the climb up didn't sit like friendly to me. I kept that thought to myself and poured us both another drink instead. Around 9, Margot found something snagged on the van side mirror that hadn't been there when we'd left that morning. A length of red string, tied in a deliberate knot, nothing that wind or branches could account for. She held it up to the firelight for a long moment before either of us said a word. I told her maybe a hiker had marked the spot for some reason of their own. Trail crews do things like that sometimes. She nodded like she believed me, but she untied it anyway and threw it into the fire without asking me first, and I understood without her saying, so that she hadn't believed a word I just told her. We went to bed uneasy that night in a way neither of us wanted to name outright, both of us lying rigid and listening past the point where listening does a person any good. Sometime past midnight, I woke to Margot's hand gripping my arm hard enough to hurt, and when I followed her eyes toward the window, I caught the tail end of a shape moving past it, low and quick, gone before I could get a clear look at anything beyond a general impression of size and speed. Neither of us slept again that night. Neither of us said the word we were both thinking. Not yet. Not until the morning gave us something we couldn't explain away. Morning showed us exactly what that shape had been doing outside our window. Deep gouges scratched into the paint along the driver's side, low to the ground, running the whole length of the van in parallel lines too even, too deliberate, to be any animal's claw marks. Margot ran her fingers over them and said out loud what I'd been thinking since I first saw them. A bear doesn't scratch in straight lines like that. Neither does a fisher cat, or a fox, or anything with 4 legs and no particular grievance against a stranger's camper van. We debated packing up right then and decided against a hasty exit, mostly because the only way out was that same gravel road the idling truck had sat on the night before, and neither of us wanted to meet whoever that was on a narrow one-lane stretch with nowhere to pull off. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line instead. Got one bar of signal that held just long enough to describe our situation before dropping. The dispatcher promised someone would swing by when a deputy cleared from another call. No firm timeline given, which out here could mean anything from 20 minutes to most of the day. While we waited, Margot did something I hadn't expected. She walked the tree line at the edge of our clearing, slow and deliberate, the way she used to walk a hospital corridor checking on patients, and came back holding a second length of red string, tied in the same deliberate knot, looped around a low branch not 15 feet from where we'd parked. She didn't burn this one. She held on to it, turning it over in her hands like evidence, and said, quiet, that whoever was doing this wanted us to know exactly how close they'd been standing. The deputy who eventually arrived, a lean older man named Castellan, who'd clearly spent decades working this stretch of county, looked at the scratches on the van for a long moment before saying anything useful at all. He told us Zor Valley had a history beyond the flash floods everybody warns you about. Hikers who came down for a day trip and simply didn't come back up, going back further than his own 20 years on the job. Most chalked up officially to the terrain itself, the loose shale, the sudden water. He didn't say outright that he believed all of those explanations. The way he said it told me plenty. Castellan recommended we relocate to one of the developed sites over toward Allegheny State Park. Said Zor wasn't worth the risk for a couple pulling a rig with no real way to defend it if something more than animals was involved. Margot didn't need convincing twice. We packed up within the hour, Castellan following us out to the main road himself, and I watched in the mirror the whole drive until his cruiser peeled off toward his next call, leaving us alone on a two-lane road that wound through more of the same dense woods we were trying to put behind us. We found a site at Allegheny with hookups and neighbors close enough to hear their radios. And for the first time in 2 days, Margot's shoulders came down from around her ears. We told ourselves out loud, in the particular way people talk themselves into believing something, that distance had solved it, that whatever had been circling us out at Zor had no reason to follow a random couple 40 minutes down the road to a different park entirely. I want to tell you we were right about that. I'd be lying. It was Margot who found it first, the third length of red string, tied around the handle of our propane tank at our new site, a place we'd chosen ourselves on a whim less than 2 hours earlier. She held it out to me without a word, and neither of us needed to say the thing out loud that we were both finally forced to accept, that whatever this was, it hadn't been tied to the location at all. It had been tied to us, specifically, and it had followed us here. That night, neither of us slept in any real sense of the word, taking turns sitting up front with the dome light off, watching a campground full of families and retirees who had no idea anything at all was wrong. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize, for words that Margot read over my shoulder before I could stop her. "You found my valley." Neither of us said anything for a long time after that. There wasn't really anything left to say that wouldn't have sounded foolish next to what we were both already feeling in our chests. By morning, we decided. No more waiting on deputies who couldn't promise a timeline. No more telling ourselves distance alone would fix this. We drive straight through to my sister's place outside Rochester, 90 minutes north, put real walls and a locked door between us, and whatever this was. Margot packed in near silence, checking the mirrors every few minutes like Castellan's cruiser might reappear out of nowhere to save us twice in the same week. I didn't tell her I'd already noticed the propane gauge reading lower than it should have, like somebody had bled it down slow overnight the same way as those string knots. Quiet, deliberate, close enough to touch us without ever once being seen. We were 40 minutes into the drive north when the check engine light came on, followed almost immediately by the temperature gauge climbing into the red. I pulled onto the shoulder of a two-lane stretch outside a little town called Springville, popped the hood, and found the radiator hose split clean through. Not worn, not cracked with age, but cut. A straight line through rubber that doesn't fail that way on its own. Margot stood next to me looking at it a long moment, before saying, very quietly, that somebody had done that while we slept at Allegheny, right there in a campground full of people, and none of us had heard a thing. We got towed into Springville by a flatbed the sheriff's office arranged for us. Dropped at a small independent garage run by a man named Osric Pell, who looked at the hose, looked at the scratches still visible along the driver's side panel, and asked, "Careful, if we'd had some kind of trouble out at Zor. When Margot asked how he knew, he said everybody local knew that Valley had a reputation. That county had quietly lost 3 or 4 people over the decades nobody official liked talk about. Hikers gone in that same slow method, followed, marked somehow, then never seen coming back out the other side of whatever happened to them. Pell told us he could have the part by the next afternoon, no sooner, and offered his own back lot to park in overnight. Said it was fenced, said his dog would raise hell at anything that came near. Margot didn't want to stay anywhere connected to that valley even secondhand. But with no working vehicle and no other option in a town that small, we didn't have much choice left to us. We spent the rest of that day in the library 2 blocks over, using their internet to search anything we could find about missing hikers tied to Zor Valley, and found exactly the vague, unsatisfying half-answers Castellan and Pell had both already given us. Pell's dog started up around 10 that night. Not the occasional bark at a passing car, but a steady, continuous growl aimed at the fence line behind the garage, refusing to come when Pell himself called it in from his house next door. Margot and I sat in the van with the doors locked, engine dead. Nothing to do but watch the dark beyond the chain link and wait for whatever had the animal so worked up to either show itself or move on. It did neither for almost 20 minutes, which was somehow worse than either outcome would have been. The dog went silent all at once, mid-growl. The way a thing goes quiet when it's decided sounding an alarm isn't worth whatever's standing in front of it anymore. Margot gripped my hand hard enough to leave marks I still had the next morning. I watched the tree line past the fence and, for just a moment, caught the outline of someone standing perfectly still between 2 trunks, watching the van with a patience that had nothing hurried about it at all, like he had all the time in the world and knew we weren't going anywhere on a dead vehicle. I don't know what made me do it, but I flashed the headlights once hard, a habit left over from 26 years of pulling up on scenes in the dark and needing to see what you were walking into. The figure didn't flinch, didn't run, just stood there another few seconds before stepping back in a deeper shadow and disappearing entirely, unhurried, like a man closing a door on his own schedule rather than anybody else's. Margot was already dialing 911 with shaking hands before I'd even lowered mine from the wheel. The deputy who responded this time wasn't Castellan, but a younger officer named Voss. And he took the report seriously enough to walk the fence line himself with a flashlight, finding nothing beyond a single set of boot prints in the soft dirt just past the tree line, pointed toward the garage, and nowhere leading away from it, like whoever made them had simply stopped existing at that spot. Voss didn't have an explanation for that either. He recommended, same as Castellan had, that we not stay in the immediate area any longer than the repair absolutely required. Pell got the part in faster than promised, had us road ready by 10 the next morning, and refused payment for the tow, which felt less like generosity and more like a man eager to have us gone from his lot before whatever had visited it the night before decided to come back around. Margot didn't argue with him about the money. We were on the road north within the hour, both of us watching the mirrors in a way that had become reflexive, automatic, a habit we hadn't asked for and couldn't seem to switch back off. We made it almost to Rochester before either of us spoke more than a few words at a time. And it was Margot who finally said what I think we'd both been circling for 2 days. That whoever this was hadn't been trying to hurt us outright. Not yet. Not with the tools he clearly had for it. He'd been enjoying the watching, the marking, the slow unraveling of 2 people who'd had no idea what they were driving into when they picked a pretty gorge off the internet. I didn't have anything better to offer her than agreement, and neither of us said out loud the part we were both thinking. That enjoying the chase doesn't mean a man plans to let it end without a conclusion of his own choosing. My sister Corinne lives on a quiet street outside Rochester. Brick colonial, motion sensor lights over both the garage and the side door, the kind of ordinary suburban setup that had never once struck me as remarkable until we pulled in her driveway feeling like it was the safest place either of us had stood in 4 days. She took one look at both our faces before we'd even said hello and asked what in God's name had happened. We told her everything over coffee at her kitchen table, and to her credit, she didn't once suggest we were exaggerating. Just got quieter and quieter as the details piled up. We stayed with Corinne 5 days, the van parked in her garage with the door locked, Margot sleeping in actual guest room silence for the first time since Zor. Voss called twice with updates that amounted to very little. The boot prints hadn't matched anything in county records. Pell's garage camera had caught nothing beyond the dog's own shadow thrown by the sodium light, and the phone number that had texted us those 4 words traced back to a burner purchased with cash at a gas station 40 miles from anywhere we'd been. No name attached, no further leads. It felt, Margot said, like being haunted by somebody with a driver's license. On the 4th night, Corinne's own motion light tripped once around 11. No one visible on her home security app beyond a blur at the edge of frame that could have been a raccoon, could have been anything. I didn't sleep after that. Neither did Margot. We sat up together in Corinne's guest room with the lights off, watching the app's live feed on my phone, and somewhere close to 1 in the morning the light tripped a second time. Same spot, same blur, gone before the camera's motion tracking could lock onto anything solid enough to call a shape. I want to tell you it ended with an arrest, with Castellan or Voss driving out personally to say they'd caught the man responsible, match him to a name, close the file the way it closed for Roland and Margot's counterparts in other stories, other counties. That isn't what happened to us. What happened is the texts simply stopped 5 days after Corinne's motion light tripped that second time. No explanation, no final message, nothing beyond an absence where Dredd had been living for the better part of a week. Voss told us these cases sometimes just go quiet like that, and quiet isn't the same thing as solved. He said it gently. It didn't land gently at all. We sold the van 11 weeks later. Margot couldn't get back into it without checking the mirrors first, without running her hand along the driver's side panel to see if the scratches had somehow come back overnight, though the body shop had buffed them out clean months before. I understood completely. I'd started doing the same thing myself, checking things that didn't need checking, counting gear that had never once actually gone missing beyond that one stolen sense of safety we'd both walked into that gorge with. We bought a house instead, small, in a development 20 minutes from Corinne, motion lights over every door the way hers had them, and neither of us has said the word camping out loud to each other since. Margot still keeps that scrapbook of everywhere we stopped, Zor Valley included, the photo of her standing on that flat rock with her arms out, happier in that single image than I'd ever really understood at the time. She won't throw the picture away. She also won't look at it for very long when she does take it out. I think about Osric Pell's dog sometimes, that dead silence in the middle of a growl. The exact moment an animal decides sounding an alarm isn't the priority, it was 30 seconds earlier. I think about it because I never got an answer for what made it stop, the same way I never got an answer for the boot prints that pointed toward a garage and led nowhere away from it. The same way I never got an answer for a burner phone bought 40 miles from anywhere we'd actually been. Some of this, I've had to accept, simply doesn't resolve the way you want it to. What stays with me isn't the scratches on the van, or even that text with its 4 flat words. It's the length of red string Margot pulled off our propane tank at a campground we picked ourselves, at random, less than 2 hours before we found it there waiting for us. That's the piece I can't put down. Somebody had been close enough to touch our gear in a stranger's campground full of families and dogs and porch lights, and not one soul among all those witnesses ever saw a thing. I don't know his name. I don't know if Zor Valley's history of hikers who never came back up out of that gorge has his fingerprints on all of it, or just some small, unlucky piece. What I know is this. Some places really do just wait, patient as shale wearing down under moving water, for somebody careless enough to stop paying attention for one single night. Margot and I paid attention every single night after that first one. It didn't stop him watching. It just meant we were watching him back, right up until the moment he finally, quietly, decided to stop,